2020. And at this point, I would like to ask the director for roll call, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, through you. We'll begin, Mr. Chair, if we could ask members of the board to have their lines on mute because we hear some feedback on the line this morning or this afternoon already. And Mr. Chair, thank you for that introduction. Good evening, trustees. This is our roll call for our board meeting of 17 June 2020. Trustee Barry.
Present.
Thank you. Trustee Cram.
Present.
Thank you. Trustee Danaher.
Present.
Thank you. Trustee Jacobs.
Present.
Thank you. Vice Chair McPherson.
Present.
Thank you. Chair McAllister.
Present.
Thank you. Trustee McRae.
Present.
Thank you. Trustee McDonald.
Present.
Thank you. Trustee Parisian.
Present.
Thank you. Trustee Schooler.
Present.
Thank you. Trustee Swan.
Present.
Thank you. Student Trustee Colton Kelford.
Present.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, you have quorum.
Thank you, Director. I'm going to move to item 501. As usual, it's a consent agenda item. It's moved by Trustee Barry, by Trustee Cram, that the Upper Canada District School Board approve consent agenda items 502 to 504, 2017, 2020. Please cast your online vote.
Mr. Chair, that motion carries.
Thank you, Lisa. Are there any conflict of interest declarations to be made?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I have one.
Yes, go ahead. Trustee McDonald, right?
I think it's item 12.04.
Okay, so noted. Thank you, Trustee McDonald. Anyone else? If not, I'm going to move to item 801. Director Sliwa, do you have any comments?
Mr. Chair, good afternoon and good evening. Yes, thank you very much. I certainly do. And trustees, I wanted to highlight a number of things that are happening in schools and around the system at this time. Members of the board will know that at each spring for the past several years, the school board has been investing in a focus around relationship building between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people through our TRC plus days, which are days of reflection and learning for our students, where we have cultural advisors and community elders working with our students and bringing their learning and their own cultural experiences and insights to a focus as part of a dialogue about building respectful relationships, both historically and currently between Indigenous peoples and Canada. We're really pleased, Mr. Chair, that, as you know, we have continued with this focus this year in terms of our virtual days of learning surrounding our building reconciliation literacy among students and honoring relationships, which is really our focus for our students and their learning, even through distance learning. We continue that key commitment, and we're very proud of the support that we've received through our Indigenous Education Department, Teaching and Learning Department, and of course, counting upon our staff to support our students in their learning over this next week, or 2 weeks, I should say, as part of a focus on Indigenous education. As well, Mr. Chair, we're getting to that time in the operational year where our staff are finalizing the evidence of learning that's been collected from students. Even in these unprecedented times, that was also important, and preparing final report cards. Parents will know from our most recent update to them this week that that material will be mailed out to them the first week of July, and we know that families will look forward to that information and that feedback about their children's learning as we think and turn our attentions to the next school year, as we always do at the end of June. And then lastly, Mr. Chair, one of the key reports that we're bringing to the board this evening is about graduation rates that we wanted to highlight or spotlight as part of shining a bright light on the board's strategic plan and the director's work plan, and also about some early thinking on school reopening and what our leadership work teams are doing in the school district. A second report will be brought to the trustees this evening to go into that in a bit more detail. And we look forward to unpacking both of those for the board tonight. So, Mr. Chair, we're going to turn this back over to you.
Thank you, Director, for your comments. It's my turn to make a few comments, and I would like to provide a few pieces of information. First of all, my apologies this evening for those who were expecting our use of Microsoft Teams. We did use this platform at last week's meeting with a degree of success. However, some did not see the advantage, while others found it difficult alternating between MS Teams and Board Docs. And the use of MS Teams has been viewed as quite successful in our committee work. So we need a bit more training, and we will certainly use Microsoft Teams in the future. Second item I wanted to mention was that my last teleconference call with Minister Lecce was on Monday, June the 8th, and the call was scheduled for the day before yesterday. The call scheduled for the day before yesterday was canceled, unfortunately, yet the Minister promised guidance for boards about the return to school in September by the end of the month. Mr. Lecce accented the priority of mental health and well-being in his remarks and intimated that this concern would be addressed in the GSN. Speaking of which, he suggested strongly that the GSNs would be announced by late last week or early this week. The GSNs would reflect the needs to help boards succeed. Unfortunately, we have heard nothing as yet concerning the GSNs or the, for that matter, the September return to school protocol, but I'm sure we'll be hearing from the Minister very shortly. He referenced the new math curriculum in grades 1 to 8, which will be shared by late June. He also referenced increased funding in the GSN to assist boards in distributing devices at school and at home. Minister Lecce announced that there would be no delay in approved capital projects, the details of which will come to the GSN. He also reported on the $150 million increase to improve broadband connectivity to rural Ontario. He has already made the announcement concerning the reopening of childcare facilities and an affirmation to the reopening of indoor and outdoor day camps this summer. I also want to publicly advise you and anyone who is interested that the board and our Director of Education, Director Sliwa, have agreed to an extension of current employment contract for 3 years until November 2020. 2023. This is really a good news story for us, knowing that we can rely on Director Sliwa's leadership and support to address our board's priorities, support our staff, and to enable the successful operation of programs for all students. And having this certainty and this continuity of service, especially important at this time, as we continue to move forward in these uncertain times of the pandemic. And we all look forward to moving the educational needle forward in the Upper Canada District School Board. So congratulations, Stephen. We appreciate that. And finally, I'd like to mention, if I could, I'm trying to switch here, that while it has not been confirmed, but I've asked by the President of OFSA to sit as a chair in a small group discussion with the Minister. And I was pleased to accept this invitation. I have yet to hear more details, but I just wanted to inform you of that. That concludes my remarks, ladies and gentlemen. So we are now going to move to 1101, which is an update from the annual Trustee Planning Session Subcommittee. And I will now turn this over to Trustee McPherson.
Thank you. We had another meeting today. All were in attendance, and we're working in different times. However, what we have discovered is there's also opportunities presented there. Basically, we are looking forward to hosting eventually sometime between September and possibly late October, ideally, that the planning session will be a face-to-face event. Having said that, we're going to start the process in July or August, in that we are focusing upon the eventual update of the strategic plan. Our committee today met with our consultants. We essentially came up with a fairly substantial list of questions for what is going to be an online survey. Rather than bringing people together physically over 1 or 2 nights, we have a unique opportunity to consult over a longer window of opportunity and on a more global basis. The plan is to release this just as school is letting out and to wrap it up by August. The first step will be to formulate the responses. The second step will go to the trustee planning session, which will then hand it off to the Accountability and Framework Committee. And lastly, they will bring it back to the trustees for what is hopefully a final draft of the update to the strategic plan. We are conducting our survey online through our own social media. We have apparently a very, very strong following out there, and it is hoped that we will meet or connect with as many placeholders as possible. The questions are based largely on the existing strategic plan, with a couple more global questions at the end of the survey. So anyways, I'll just pause at that and see if there's any questions or concerns from the table.
Thank you, Vice Chair McPherson. Are there any questions or comments that you would like to direct to the Vice Chair or the Chair of SIA? Or the Chair, the Chair of the Annual Trustee Planning Session? Hearing none, Vice Chair, continue the good work with your committee, and we look forward to the results of your planning. I'm going to move to 1102, which is the report of the Special Education Advisory Committee. And again, Vice Chair McPherson, you are on tap.
Okay, I'm just trying to find my other hat here. And, okay, right now we got her, just popping it up on the screen here. We met by a teleconference on the 2nd of June. It was quite an interesting meeting. We are still using momentum. First off, we had a presentation from Hackergal, which is it's fairly local. It's based in Beckwith Township, which is Trustee Cram's bailiwick, and they're hosting, and they're aiming at special education students and females. They're putting on a hacker camp, and they are using, I believe, Links technology, and it's pretty amazing, and they're doing this all online. It's kind of mind-boggling that you can hold people all together sitting in front of their computers. And they will do some programming, and for some strange reason, they picked me to be one of the judges, and boy, is that ever like blind leading the blind. So, and then we had a presentation on what was available for a budget update from Jeremy Hobbs, and as well with a superintendent's report followed up. And we did have some motions that came to the board, and it should be noted that we also have a minority report. The first motion that we have is the Special Education Advisory Committee recommends to the Upper Canada District School Board trustees that special education plan be approved as updated. That motion carried, I believe, 1 opposed, 2 abstained, and 8 in favor. So anyways, that's the first motion. The special education plan is largely a series of updates accommodating staff changes and a few things like that. Nothing that changed the direction of the plan that has been in place for the last few years. Then we also had a secondary motion that essentially was done to, I would say, set the tone of the implementation of the Power Up program. And one is kind of connected to the other, and the most important one is the first one. The other one is simply an indication of some of the feelings around the table at CIAC. It's up to the chair to decide what he wants done with the second motion. However, I would like to ask the first motion be approved and be moved on and voted on. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair McPherson. I'm going to read the motion, and then we will have a discussion. I have a motion moved by Trustee Danaher, seconded by Trustee Jacob, that the Upper Canada District School Board approves the revisions to the Special Education Plan for 2020-2021 as presented June 17, 2020, based on the recommendations from the Special Education Advisory Committee. I'm opening the floor for discussion.
Through you, Chair, I have a question.
Go ahead, Trustee Swan.
I'm just wondering, the vote was divided at CIAC. Is this not correct, Trustee McMillan?
You mean Vice Chair McPherson?
Sorry, Vice Chair McPherson, yes.
Yes.
Can you expand?
Well, you don't always get a unanimous support for any motion. We have one member that was the member that has filed the Minority Report was quite opposed to approving the spec ed plan this year, largely because the association that she represents is essentially against any form of special education rather than full inclusion. So the Minority Report essentially reflects her comments that evening when we debated approval of the spec ed plan. 2 people chose to abstain, simply maybe they didn't feel they were comfortable voting, but the balance of the board, including another representative of the same association, voted to approve it.
Thank you.
Trustee McPherson, I have a question for you. With regard to the Power Up program, were there any, I know it was approved, correct? Did they indicate their level of approval in terms of our priority 1, priority 2, or priority 3?
It wasn't necessary this year because the trustees had not decided upon what level they were going to support until our last board meeting. And so they were aware of the 3 potential options that was discussed in the superintendent's report. However, it was not something that was put to the vote simply because the spec ed plan does not indicate the degree of engagement. It really doesn't mention Power Up specifically. It is simply a roadmap for delivering special education to our students.
Could I ask a supplementary, Vice Chair? Were there any questions or concerns about the special education plan as presented?
Not particularly. It all focused around the Power Up program.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions? Seeing none, folks, we are going to move to Article 1201, which is the Director's Award of Merit, and I will turn this over to Director Stewart.
Chair McAllister, can I interrupt for a second? We just have a motion on the floor. Thank you.
Yes, you are absolutely correct, and I apologize. So there is a motion on the floor. Would you please cast your ballot?
Chair McAllister, that motion unanimously carries.
Thank you, Lisa, for catching me. I appreciate that. Director Sable, I'm going to turn this over to you, please. We are moving to the Director's Award of Merit. Director Slaybaugh.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you, trustees will know around the table that the Director's Award of Merit comes actually from a set of recommendations that the board brought forward as part of its annual work plan a few years back. And it's been an unqualified success. We always have a strong level of participation among staff, families, members of the community, and even students that enter nominations with regards to how their staff have brought their best selves to their work in a consistent way that's made a material difference in the experiences that our students have at school and in what our staff have in the workplace in terms of having these very well-regarded colleagues working alongside them and working together on behalf of our students. This spring, Mr. Chair, we had a banner number of recommendations or nominations, I should say, 77, coming from all across the school board through a variety of different job categories and including nominators who are parents, co-workers, supervisors, and students. So again, Mr. Chair, it's been very well received. It's my pleasure, Mr. Chair, to bring the following recipients of the Spring 2020 Award to the Board's attention, beginning with Nancy Lalonde. Ms. Lalonde is a spec ed teacher at the RO School and has a very strong series of details that have been brought forward as part of her nomination to this award. Joining Ms. Lalonde is Melanie Spence, a teacher at Rideau Vista Public School. Joining Ms. Spence and Ms. Lalonde is Rebecca McLeod, who's at our T.R. Legier Alexandria campus, and we were very pleased to receive her nomination and the very glowing reports from her nominator as well. Following Ms. McLeod and Ms. Spence and Ms. Lalonde, we have Luc Decour, or Mr. Luc as he's known, the custodian at Williamstown Public School. And I know that when the full nomination is put out through our social media, when we celebrate and recognize these people, folks will see that Mr. Luc was indeed a very worthy candidate and recipient for this award. And next we have Mr. Chair Kim Cook, who is the office assistant at our T.R. Legier STEP program at our Elmont campus. So we congratulate Ms. Cook on her nomination and her recognition as an award winner this year. And lastly, Mr. Chair, I want to bring to the board's attention Sue Van Leeuwen. And Ms. Van Leeuwen is a special education teacher at South Grenville District High School, very well regarded, including her efforts to do a very successful transition of engaging and supporting her students over the last many months as we moved from a face-to-face program environment to really a synchronous learning, distance learning environment. And her nomination emphasizes how she supported learners and parents with her time and patience in this transition. And I think in many ways, Ms. Van Leeuwen personifies what many of our staff have gone through over the last 4 months to make sure that students and parents could see the learning taking place at a distance and to know that children were supported during this very different program delivery time. So, Mr. Chair, it's my pleasure to recommend these people to the board, I should say to acknowledge these people before the board and to congratulate them on being award winners for this Spring 2020. Mr. Chair, I'll turn that back over to you.
Thank you, Director. I'd like to extend my sincere congratulations to the nominees as well and the award recipients. I think given the number of nominations, it certainly proves that this award is very successful. I also want to just put a little plug in there for the Trustee Innovation Award because it's coming up next. So I'll leave that to Trustee Parisian if she wishes to comment at some point. However, it's nice to recognize our own folks because they are doing some really good work out there. So thank you, Director. I am now going to move to item 1202, which is a little recognition of our student trustee, Colton Kelford. And Director, do you want to take the lead on this one?
Mr. Chair, yes, it would be my pleasure to do so. Trustees, as you know, our student trustees are very valued members of the Board of Trustee table. They bring insight and candor that really does benefit the board in terms of getting closer to the learning experience for our students. And they also represent 27,000 students and the voice of that 27,000 students as much as our elected board members do as well. Mr. Kelford has had a highly successful term of office that, as trustees know, began on August 1st of 2019, and actually we still have several weeks left of Trustee Kelford's time his official term ends on July 31 of this summer, but we wanted to make sure that Mr. Kelford also had the opportunity to walk the board through his year in review and to entertain questions that the board may have in terms of the unique insight and privilege that he has of working directly with a wide array of students, including the UCDSB Student Senate. So, Mr. Chair, I'll turn this over to Trustee Kelford and look forward to hearing from him regarding his presentation.
All right, then Student Trustee Kelford, you are on tap.
Well, thank you for that introduction. It'll be hard to follow up, but to begin, if all of you could pull up the PDF consisting of my PowerPoint, that would be much appreciated. So, to begin, the year of 2019-2020, I have had the pleasure of serving the Upper Canada District School Board Student Senate while acting as their chairman. From the very start, I got to witness students that were passionate and eager to advocate their thoughts and concerns when in regard to the betterment of their education. From policies to mandates, structural issues to curriculum, this set of students are consistently exerting their best effort to bring solutions to fruition. During our first meeting, we set out to create a list of goals that we believe would be achievable and beneficial. Beginning the list is a topic of bring together student voice across the board. With the new reality of distance learning, this is more prominent and crucial than ever, and receiving widespread student feedback has been crucial for continuing our daily life from home. The second priority topic was to ensure completion of the refresh of the UCDSB Character Always, and what should Character Always 2.0 look like in our schools. Working closely with Superintendent McNair, the senators had a blast with this revitalization of the Character Always program within our school board. Our priority topic number 3 was to increase mental health support for students across the board. The one thing that we were fortunate enough to do in regards to this was create a partnership with Planet Youth. The partnership will allow Planet Youth to survey UCDSB grade 10 students regarding risk and protective factors influencing substance use by youth. The agreement will also provide opportunities to collaborate on community-led initiatives to prevent substance use among the youth residing in other communities that is served by our board. Granted, it is not directly mental health, but it is a topic that heavily affects many students within our board and Senate, and our senators truly appreciated this step in the right direction. The fourth priority topic was to have the Senate be much more involved within the board advisory process. And this year, I truly believe that the senators did an incredible job in regards to providing feedback that would directly reach the board table and be heard by all. Our fifth, not final, but our fifth priority task was to complete the Student Senate Handbook. I don't know if all of you have had the pleasure of looking at it, but the teamwork that was inputted was incredible, and the final product was astounding. Now, to go on to our Student Senate elections. This year, we did hold our Student Senate elections on February 25th, 2020, and as you know, we were fortunate enough to be elected the 2 new student trustees for the 2020-2021 school year, and that is Ms. Kane Hughes from SFDCI and Mr. Jordan Evans. They will be my predecessors, and I truly do believe that they will do an incredible job. Now to continue to OSTA-ACO. This year, I was fortunate enough to be a member of OSTA-ACO and be a part of their widespread national advocacy, releasing various position papers on LGBTQ+, gender expression, and gender inclusivity, as well as advocating for mental health and wellness through the Ontario Public Students Wellness Summit. Here, I was able to truly network and advocate at a national level, and it's something that I could truly never put a value on. It was a priceless experience. And now to go to this final slide. This final slide is a picture of all the trustees this year. This year, I came into the position as a wide-eyed young man and was fortunate enough to be able to work with all of your incredible selves. I would truly just like to thank each and every one of you because at one time or another, each and every one of you have helped me learn and grow within this position. And the skills that you all have taught me here will stay within me throughout my future career. This concludes my year-in-term report, and I truly appreciate everything you've done for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colton. I'm wondering, Trustee Graham, I didn't know if you were there, if you would like to say a few words as a mentor to Colton, and you've done some great work with him. So if you have any few words, feel free to join me.
Thank you, Chair. Can you hear me right now?
Yes, you can.
Thank you. I've had the pleasure of being the Student Senate advisor for the last few years. And when I first met Colton in September, as we all met him in September, I wondered what we were in for. To my delight, Colton has done an exceptional job this year. The discussion at Student Senate is probably one of the best discussions I've seen. I think Director Schlewak could probably attest to that when we were asking the students for some input as to what they thought was working well and what they thought needed to be improved at the board. Some excellent feedback under Colton's direction. The work that was done in the student handbook this year was exceptional, and if you have not seen the student handbook, the Senate handbook, I strongly suggest you go and see it. And I know that Jody and April have a lot to do with putting in the final touches to it to bring it up to a professional standard. And I'd like to commend them for it. And but Colton was the one who gave them all of the information they needed to do that. So Colton, exceptional year, and I was pleased to work with you.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
Thanks, Don. Trustees, if you have any comments or questions, I would happily receive them now.
Yeah, I have a question, Mr. Chair. It's John McRae.
Go ahead, Trustee McRae.
Thank you. I think, Colton, you can be assured that all of us wish you well and expect to hear more of your successes in the future. In the past, before it became obvious to all of us, you spoke at our table about rural connectivity and how it impacted students in various negative ways and positive ways. But I'm curious, firsthand from you, you're taking on some challenges educationally this fall, but they're going to be online, I gather. And I'm wondering if you have any advice or suggestions or ideas for the rest of your fellow trustees at the table about online learning. And good luck. Thanks. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
To answer that, I think the only thing that you truly can do is stay positive, especially in a time as bearing as this. And in regards to education, it's just a different form of reception, and truly, I've enjoyed online learning, and I hope our students are as well.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments?
Through you, Chair. This is Trustee Perry.
Yes, go ahead, Trustee Perry.
Thank you. I just want to thank Colton for your participation, your everything you've done this year. It's always great to have a student trustee around the table. It gives us trustees a different perspective of really understanding what's going on firsthand with the students. And you are always in touch with your peers within the school. And you were always able to give us insight as to what was going on. So I thank you for sharing, and I thank you for keeping your peers in touch with you. So thanks for everything, and wishing you all the best next year.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Trustee Perry. I will conclude this presentation by simply saying that reading to you what I wrote to Colton in his package, which was presented to him last Friday by our Trustee Liaison Officer Lisa Workman and Director Sewa and myself at his cottage, his parents' cottage, and we had a lovely visit, social distancing. But we had a good time. Colton, I note your passion and interest in political science. You have been involved this far in two levels of municipal politics, the town of Smith Falls and the Upper Canada District School Board. And this municipal aspect, in my opinion, is by far the most important because it deals with the issues that affect people the most directly. What I've learned in my many years of political involvement is that the most enduring quality is the willingness and ability to listen. Good decisions, therefore, follow not easily but naturally. So you have done that in representing the student voice at the board table very well. And I thank you, and I wish you the very best in your university career and wherever that will take you.
Thank you.
Chair, I do have a comment. I do have a question.
Yes, go ahead, Trustee Cram.
It's just a segue. It's not necessarily to Colton, and perhaps the director might be better to give us an answer on it. In their objectives and their goals, number 3 mentioned a partnership with Planet Youth. And I know Planet Youth did a presentation to the board in the fall. I'm wondering if we at some point can get an update as to board involvement and where we are with Planet Youth at this time.
I will bring that to Management Council, Trustee Cram, and we will assure you that there will be a report.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Anyone else? If not, I'm going to move to our Article 1203. And we now will have the Communications and Relationship Management Plan update by our Manager of Communications, April Scott Clark, and I will ask the Director to tee this up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you, as you know, trustees, the board's policy and procedure around communications includes an annual report to the board about its communications outcomes for the past year. We do have April Scott Clark, who's online today with us, our Manager of Communications, and she'll be bringing forward to you an update, the annual update, that looks at both the general and specific elements around communications in our school district, and to highlight for the board as well that what we are trying to do through our communications plan is to ensure that the community has up-to-date knowledge about how we are supporting learning, how we support schools, how we are tied into the community and the community's values as part of our delivery of educational programs, and also to make sure that we have a continued presence in the public domain around how we are working together for the mutual benefit of our students. So I know that our manager, Ms. Scott, will be bringing forward that to you this evening, and we welcome any questions that you may have following the presentation. So April, I'll turn this over to you and welcome you to walk through this year's report for our board.
Thank you. Good evening, trustees. So as you are aware, this was a bit of a transitional year for the Communications and Relationship Management Department due to organizational structure change and a move to more strategic communications by the department itself. Some of the two major changes were how we track our work. So the communications team tracked its work to ensure that all priority areas are being addressed and did so previously by categorizing the work within the 5 Ps. So that was places, programs, pupils, parents, and professions. This year, we shifted this categorization process to directly align with the board's strategic plan through and the associated goals. This really enabled our team to keep crew front of mind in our work. If you look up on your screen, or if you can bring up on your screen, the one-page summary of the work that we've done this year to advance the strategic plan, you'll see in the top right corner an example of how we track our steps. We have, under collaboration, you'll see just a sampling of some of the things that we've done. So school visits, C4K support, board meeting coverage, and community outreach. Under resources, there's multiple things we've done with health and safety on promoting videos to director's annual reports and advertising. Educational programs is one that we're very heavy in. We do a lot to support multiple departments throughout the organization. And of course, wellness. We do a lot within our schools and within our system to make sure that people understand what wellness practices we have in place and how we are having caring and supportive environments. The other big change was our strategy. So the core of our work hasn't changed, but how the team approaches the work and delivers the outcome has. So the team takes more of a strategic approach to deliverables, providing insight into interdepartment projects, often getting involved early in the process. This is common practice within school board communications. An example of this would be our planning our kindergarten registration campaign and the support materials that go along with that. We work not only with our early learning team, but also with planning to align timelines, where in the past, sometimes that was a bit of siloed work. Another example would be in our news releases that we do about events or projects happening at the school. We make sure that we're highlighting the events and the projects, but also specifically linking to how that relates to curriculum and programming. Another aspect of our report that has been a traditional portion to the board is our key metrics surrounding our connecting with the public through our social media channels. And so if you look at the bottom left-hand corner, you'll see some of the key metrics around that. So the UCDSB is active on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and we do use Snapchat, although we use it very sparingly and strategically. So just some overall notes is that our audiences on all of our platforms have increased. So that means we have more people following our accounts and seeing what we're putting out there. Our engagement on most of our platforms has increased, and by engagement I mean like, comments, shares, and specifically link clicks. This is really important for us because this is where we get a lot of our feedback, and we know what our parents like, what they don't like, and we often receive many messages through the private messaging system in Facebook. Instagram is our fastest growing platform in audience and engagement, and you'll notice in the bottom left-hand corner there that we grew just over 11,000 engagements this year, and we grew our audience by 164. Facebook does remain to be our largest audience, and as you know, not only is the board on Facebook, but also every one of our schools. We've also had a lot of success reaching our audiences through paid social media advertising. And if you put our top left-hand corner of that document, you'll see a bit of an overview of our kindergarten registration advertising.
We seem to have lost April. Are you coming back, April?
So, Mr. Chair, I'll just reach out just to make sure that we're not on mute or disconnected. So just a moment, please. Mr. Chair, Ms. Scott is calling back.
That's fine. We'll wait. I hear someone.
Mr. Chair, April is calling back in momentarily.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, everybody. I'm back.
Hi, April. Why don't you just take off where you left off?
Terribly sorry about that. That was not for dramatic purposes. So, as I was saying, our kindergarten registration campaign still uses multiple platforms. We have newspapers and radio, which remains the same, but we have a growing portion being dedicated to digital. In the top left-hand corner of that one-page diagram, you'll see that in our winter and spring registration campaigns, we kept our coverage with across the board pretty much the same in all of our radio and newspapers. We just changed the timeline for the campaign. And if you look down to the social media stats around it, you'll see that we're reaching a large number of people. So impressions means the number of times that the ad is run, and reach means the number of times that someone saw the ad. So we know that our newspapers, for instance, have a coverage range of about 4,000 to 15,000 people. However, we don't necessarily know who is reading the papers or how many times if people actually saw our ad or not. So the benefit of our digital advertising is that you can see the number of people who've actually seen your ad. You know how many times your ad has actually appeared, and you can target your ad to specific demographics. So we are having a really good, response to this, and we do foresee continuing with this and growing it in the future. Underneath that, you'll see that we continue with our brand awareness advertising. So the purpose of this is to just keep our brand front and center within the community. So when people are choosing a school they want to go to, they'll think of us first. So some examples of that are rink boards, menus and restaurants, special recognition days and weeks. An example would be Remembrance Day or Fire Prevention Week. We place ads and newspapers on that, as well as do online, non-paid things, and community advertising and events. So just moving on from that part of it. So how we plan for the following year is that we always get feedback from our system and the public on how we can better communicate with our teams and how we can increase our practices, how we can support our administrators in our schools, and how we can keep parents better informed of district operations. This year, sorry about that. This year, we went to superintendent family school meetings, parent involvement committee meetings, and we obviously regularly monitor a communications inbox and our social media platforms. What we heard most often this year is that schools would like us to continue with website and social media support and training for their administrators and their staff. Crisis communication support from our team is valued by our school administrators. The goal now is to increase awareness within that group of the support that we can provide. For instance, we help with creating the letters to go home, social media messaging, things of that nature. They also really appreciate centrally derived messaging around common issues when there's a need for a district-wide message. And this also helps us as a whole so that we know that everyone is getting the same message and at the same time. And also, we should find ways to continue to communicate with our parents and aid in the promotion of My Family Room use. So this feedback, combined with what we've learned from our colleagues and our professional associations, really helps guide us into the new school year. So our high-level goals for 2020-2021 are, and as you'll see, they are outlined on the one-pager, which will align our work with a strategic plan and work to promote district successes. For example, when goals are achieved through the director's work plan. We're going to continue to highlight the successes of our school for the rest of the district and for our community. This hope is that it will help with the knowledge sharing between schools, more collaboration, and greater recognition for our schools and students within our communities. We're going to continue to communicate with parents as needed centrally to ensure a common message is being delivered to everyone, and develop new communication channels for district-level information to trickle down to parents, staff, and to students. So, Mr. Chair, that concludes this portion of the presentation, and I'd be happy to take any questions you or other trustees may have.
Thank you very much, April. Trustees, do you have any questions or comments?
I would like to make a comment.
Go ahead, Trustee Barry.
I'm glad to see that the newspapers are not being completely ignored. I know that you can't measure whether somebody's read it like you can with the social media, but the little local newspaper is still being read by older people who are taxpayers, and it fits in with the branding awareness. Still knows that the schools are up and alive and aware in the communities. So thank you for including the newspapers and the radio stations.
Thank you, Trustee Barry. Any other questions? I would like to say, April, that your one-pager is excellent. Mind you, I would expect no less from a communications expert such as yourself. I know that you and your team are everywhere in this board. I really don't know how you do all that. And trustees, as you may or may not know, but on occasion, like regularly, I will get a call from April saying, John, I have 2 or 3 media, TV, radio, or print requests for an interview, and not only will she set them up, but she'll also provide me with some background information. So, April, you have a lot of successes here. You also have a lot of challenges, and I wish you well for your goals for 2020, 2021. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Trustee,
can I make a comment?
Yes, go ahead, Trustee McPherson.
Thank you. Your level of engagement on your social media stats, I find, is both amazing and encouraging. I know that we're kind of going through difficult times right now, but it's really comforting to see this level of engagement on something that largely didn't exist 10 or 12 years ago. So my commendations on that as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other comments? If not, I'm going to move to Article 1204, which is the 2020-2021 Board Credit and Lease Facility Resolutions. And I will turn this over to our Executive Superintendent of Business Services, Mr. Hobbs.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good evening, everybody. I'm pleased to bring to you this short report. Annually, and usually in concert or close around the time of passing the budget, Board of Trustees pass a motion for borrowing. And as you may be aware, from time to time, for a variety of purposes, the board needs to borrow on generally a short-term basis, often when it's related to operating needs, in order to support cash flow needs until the Ministry of Education transfer payments or funding support will arrive. So the board has a banking contract with RBC, and it's been updated to reflect the lease and credit facilities that are required for the board for the upcoming year. So even though we don't have a budget, it's not necessarily needed for us to have a budget in order to pass this, but this really sets the stage for us to get going and in preparation for the 2020-21 school year. So the recommendations are as follows: that the Upper Canada District School Board authorizes administration to borrow funds as stipulated in Board Policy 325 and consistent with the board's banking contract for cash flow purposes and to support the operating needs of the board in the amount of $25 million. And that really, again, that particular one is to support the operating needs at times when the sort of expense demands on the board are such that we are still waiting for ministry transfer payments to arrive, for example, in the September timeframe, when we're trying to make payroll and get the school year going and that kind of thing, and the funding just hasn't arrived, we'll often invoke these credit facilities. The second recommendation is that the Upper Canada District School Board authorize a lease facility with its bank, RBC, in the amount of $3 million for short-term borrowing needs related to capital expenditures and the acquisition of equipment through fixed-term lease. This really is a legacy piece that is not invoked frequently, if at all, in fact, and it was related to a historic way we used to do technology acquisition in previous years, pre-PSAB, Public Sector Accounting Board, and I don't believe it's been used certainly recently. Recommendation number 3 is that the Upper Canada District School Board authorize a credit facility with its bank, RBC Royal Bank, in the amount of $20 million for short-term borrowing needs related to capital projects until such time as Ministry of Education funding is received. So, as you know, we have a fairly big roster of approved capital projects and capital funding on the books, upwards of $100 million cumulatively, even though all of those projects are in various stages of development. And so from time to time, what happens is we'll get going on a project, whether it's an addition or starting on a school build, and in order to maintain cash flow, we'll need to execute some short-term borrowing, and then the ministry will flow the funds to us and top us up. So this credit facility is used for that kind of purpose. And then the final one is that the Upper Canada District School Board authorize a credit facility with its bank, RBC Royal Bank, in the amount of $2 million by way of letters of credit and letters of guarantee. So again, something that's used in construction. What we're seeing to an increasing extent is that oftentimes when we're working with capital projects in a municipality, the municipality is the authority sort of approving the project and overseeing compliance will ask for a letter of credit, and that's something that this allows us to provide, right, in order to keep moving with those capital projects. So these 4 recommendations, there's nothing here that's changed from the previous year, so all absolutely consistent with what was approved last year. And again, nothing, it's really a kind of a routine matter for us that just allows us to keep smoothly proceeding into the 2021 school year with the projects and operational needs facing the board. And that is it for my presentation on this matter, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hobbs. Any questions?
Through your chair, Trustee Schooler here.
Go ahead, Trustee Schooler.
Superintendent had mentioned that it's a contract that we have with this institution. When is that contract up for renewal?
I actually don't know off the top of my head, Trustee Schooler. It would be a contract that's periodically I would go through procurement. And I'm actually just hearing from my staff that we're moving forward with actually the next round of procurement, which would occur next year.
Supplemental, if I may. That's a large amount of money that we're borrowing. What is the cost to the board for borrowing those funds?
So I think that it's important to note, Trustee Schooler, that we're not actually borrowing those specific amounts. It's up to. So in the case of, for example, number 4, where we're authorized to sort of secure letters of credit up to $2 million, I think the actual outstanding amount is $85,000 at the moment. So by no means is it we're borrowing that amount for even a year. It would ebb and flow, and I'd have to the interest rate would fluctuate. So I'd have to actually get information on what the sort of current interest rate is for you.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? I have a question for you, Director, as Secretary of the Board. These recommendations come to us yearly. They're, I would say, pro forma. Is there any objection to passing all 4 en bloc?
No, I can't.
Mr. Chair, through you, there is not. However, I think it's important that trustees have the opportunity, if they wish, to respond or address any of their basic recommendations that are there. I think the board really would be best served by addressing each motion at a time rather than in a blanket way.
All right, I'll take my lead from you, sir. So I have one recommendation, that the Upper Canada District School Board authorizes administration to borrow funds as stipulated in Board Policy 325 cash management and consistent with the Board's banking contract for cash flow purposes and to support the operating needs of the Board in the amount of $25 million. Any questions? If not, please cast your ballot.
Mr. Chair, may I just ask, do we have a mover and a seconder for that, sir?
No, we do not. I need a mover, please.
Trustee Parisian.
Trustee Parisian, a seconder?
John Danaher, second.
So I'm going to use you two, if you don't mind, for all four. Is that okay?
Okay with me, yeah.
Okay. Please cast your ballot then.
Mr. Chair, that motion carries.
Thank you. Recommendation number 2. The Canada District School Board authorized a lease facility with its bank, RBC Royal Bank, in the amount of $3 million for short-term borrowing needs related to capital expenditures and acquisition of equipment through fixed-term lease. Any questions? Hearing none, please cast your ballot.
Mr. Chair, that motion carries.
Thank you. Recommendation number 3, that the Upper Canada District School Board authorize a credit facility with its bank, RBC Royal Bank, in the amount of $20 million for short-term borrowing needs related to capital projects until such time as Ministry of Education funding is received. Any questions? Please cast your ballot.
Mr. Chair, that motion carries.
Thank you. Recommendation number 4, that the Upper Canada District School Board authorize a credit facility with its bank, RBC Royal Bank, in the amount of $2 million by way of letters of credit and letters of guarantee. Any questions? Hearing none, please cast your ballot.
Mr. Chair, that motion carries.
Executive Superintendent of Business, Mr. Hobbs, thank you very much for your presentation. We appreciate it. We are now going to move to financial forecast number 3, and I believe that I am turning this over to you once again.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And again, good evening, everybody. And it's my pleasure to bring to you financial forecast number 3. And hopefully you have the slides in front of you. I'm just going to jump into slide number 2. And it's a graphic that you're probably all familiar with. And it really tries to describe the business cycle that we undertake as a finance department. And it really comprises a couple of major activities. At any time during the course of a given school year or fiscal year, we're generally in the finance department working on 2 different fiscal years. So when we start up school in the September timeframe, we're working on managing the current fiscal year, but we're also in the process of closing out the books from the previous fiscal year, the school year that just ended. And then we get into the springtime like this, we're actually continuing to work on the current fiscal year, which in this case is the 2019-20 fiscal year. But we're also starting to plan for the 2021 school year, which is the budget process. And I just really like to make sure at this time of year that sometimes with all the financial presentations that are going on, I'd like to make the distinction that tonight's presentation is not about the budget for the 2021 school year, but really about how we see the remainder of the current fiscal year evolving, so the 19-20 school year, and how do we see in the finance department, based on all of the information we've been able to harvest from the senior team and their departments, so what our financial posture is going to look like come August 31st, 2020. So moving on to slide number 3, as you'll recall, on March 25th, I brought the financial forecast number 2 for the 1920 school year. We're just actually, I think, probably at the start of the COVID pandemic, and uncertain, of course, as to how it was going to pan out, and a lot has obviously changed since that time. At the time, we were projecting an in-year surplus of $2.0 million, so that's what we were projecting to end the 1920 school year with on August 31st. And we anticipated that would lead to an accumulated surplus balance projection of $6.2 million for compliance purposes at the end of the year. But the pandemic situation, as you know, has continued to evolve. We now have certainty that the school will not resume for the 1920 school year, and there's been some significant changes to revenue and expenditures as a result of that pandemic. So moving on to slide 4, one of the things that I think is important, we're always, because so much of our organization and our financials is driven by enrollments, it's important for us to lead off with that major driver. And believe it or not, even at this late stage between March 25th and today, enrollments have continued to change slightly. So what we're seeing is that in elementary, between the last forecast, March 25th, and today, we're down 1 elementary student. At the secondary panel, we're actually up net 35 students. And in adult day, continuing ed, and summer school, we're down 27 students. So overall, compared to where we were on March 25th, up a total of 7 students. So moving on to the next slide, slide 5, the financial forecast to August 31st, 2020. This really is the executive summary of how our financial posture has changed or is forecast to change from financial forecast number 2 to today's forecast number 3. So in terms of revenue, we're projecting that we will be down $12 million in revenue, or $11.7 million in revenue, compared to what we thought we would end with back on March 25th. And as alarming as that sounds, we're down even further in terms of our projected expenditures. So while we were projecting expenses of $370 million on March 25th, we're now projecting that will drop by $16.3 million to $353.7 million by August 31st. The net result of all this, of course, is when our expenses drop faster than our revenue, is that we now feel that our year-ending position will be $4.6 million better than originally anticipated. So the main contributors for that, and there are many, but the main net contributors here are a reduction in school budget expenses. So as you can imagine, with schools being shut down, awful lot of expenditures that are not being incurred now by schools to the tune of approximately $2.2 million. CO operating without busing running, they're still incurring expenditures as per the contract, but at a reduced rate. So they're forecasting a $1.4 million improvement in their financial position, which of course, our financial position, I should say, in terms of our contribution to steel. In terms of centrally in charge instructional staff, which really predominantly is around supply staff, we're expecting that we will have a $800,000 or $0.8 million improvement in our position. And with regard to GSN and tuition fee revenues that are related to enrollment, a $0.2 or $200,000 improvement. So overall, what you're seeing is the year-end picture compared to what it was on March 25th of this year is we're anticipating now $4.6 million better than we were anticipating on March 25th. So moving on to slide number 6. Again, one of the things that's a major thrust for us is around compliance. So we have a requirement for us to make sure that we are not running a deficit or running a deficit that is 1% of our operating allocation. So we are anticipating with a high degree of confidence that the board will be compliant in that regard this year. And also, we were required to ensure our administration and governance-related expenditures are within the funding envelope that's provided, and we are very confident we will be compliant as of August 31st, 2020 there as well. One of the things that I think that, is important for us to remember is that even though at the time of we set a budget every year in the June or May timeframe, we tend to sometimes think that once we set the budget, it's locked in and nothing will change after that fact. But in reality, what happens is the ministry refers to our budget as our estimates or our original estimates for a specific reason that we know that things are going to evolve and change to some extent throughout the course of the year. And that's not unusual, but in this year, what I would say is unusual is a result of a variety of factors coming together, including, of course, the global pandemic that has actually really amplified, I think, some of the evolution that we would normally see. So the purpose of slide 7, and the title of slide 7 is Evolution of Projected In-Year Surplus for 1920, is to show you how things have evolved over the course of the year. So if you'll recall back to this time last year, we passed an original budget with which was essentially a break-even budget, $0 surplus. By the time the revised estimates forecast number 1 was passed in late fall, we were forecasting a $1.4 million surplus at year-end, August 31st, 2020. By the time we got to March 25th, 2020, in financial forecast number 2, that projected surplus had crept up to approximately $1.9 million at the end of the year. And as of today, financial forecast number 3, we are now anticipating a $6.6 million surplus. So moving on to slide 8, what does that do essentially for our balance sheet? So as you will know, our operating accumulated surplus, what we're anticipating now when we started out in September with a $2.3 million deficit, negative balance, we're anticipating that will increase by $4.3 million to $2.0 million at year-end. The total internally appropriated surplus available for compliance, which is, I think, incorporates things like school-generated funds, for example. That will increase by $2.3 million to $8.8 million in total. And therefore, our total accumulated surplus deficit available for compliance, we're anticipating will increase by $6.6 million. So that's where we anticipate ourselves ending this year. That gets added to the pile of our total accumulated surplus available for compliance, if you will, leaving us with a total accumulated surplus available for compliance of $10.8 million as our projected balance as at August 31st, 2020. Our total externally appropriated surplus, which is unavailable for compliance, and again, this would be the kind of thing that would incorporate, you'll recall, a fund that we've been accumulating for a number of years to offset liability for employee future benefits. That will grow by $5.7 million as planned to $8.5 million. So again, quite significant changes here for you to digest as a result of our sort of ongoing pandemic changes that we've experienced this year. Moving on to slide 9. I think one of the things that we're trying to get at here is to share with you what we see as some potential sources of variability even remaining. So even though we're now mid-June, there's really 2.5 months left in our fiscal year. Even if we were in a normal operating stance with school, that we would be drawing that to a close, there still does represent some potential for variance here. So what are the things that could contribute to a reduction in our operating surplus that we're projecting to be $6.6 million now? So, for example, if schools or central departments were to jump up some of their in-year budget spending in anticipation of a surplus, that would have the effect of reducing our sort of year-end board-wide surplus. If we felt we needed to increase spending related to COVID-19, so for example, if we were to do some things that were to in this fiscal year, with the intention of preparing for our opening of schools in September, buying goods, for example, would erode that $6.6 million surplus. And if there is any, if the ministry, though we don't anticipate it to be so, if there is there's any uncertainty with regard to their position on unspent funds, if they were to, for example, claw back certain kinds of funding or those kinds of things, that could have the potential of eroding a surplus. On the other hand, there are some factors that may actually increase that surplus. In addition to, of course, further spending constraint. You'll recall that this year, through the efforts of Superintendent Ferguson and his team last year, there was a massive increase in the number of applications for SIP funding that were completed, and that is special instance portion funding related to special education. There was, I think, around $3.1 million in applications that were sent into the ministry. As yet, we haven't heard what our level of success will be on those, even though we have every reason to believe we'll be successful. And as a result, we've taken a correspondingly conservative approach to budgeting. So as you know, in this year, we only anticipated or budgeted for a $750,000 SIP funding amount. So if the remaining $2.4 million of that SIP funding comes in, it will have the effect of increasing that $6.6 million to closer to $9 million. Right now, we have also rural and northern education funds of $1.4 million that were allocated for the 1920 fiscal year, but owing to a variety of factors, those haven't been committed for this year. And as a result, we're recommending that we defer those funds into the next fiscal year so that we can make use of them to support the operational needs of schools and the district in the next fiscal year, 2021. If, on the other hand, we choose to show those as revenue in this fiscal year, 1920, and we chose not to spend them in this fiscal year, that would be a further $1.4 million addition to that surplus at the end of the year. And so those are some of the flavors to give you a sense of some of the things that sort of could push and pull on that $6.6 million surplus to the end of the fiscal year. So moving forward to slide 10. So you know this graph well. This is really sort of our multi-year forecast of what our anticipated sort of posture looks like. And what you can see if you look at, this says, the title of the slide for those of you orienting yourselves is Multi-Year Financial Plan 2019-20 to 2025-26. 26 is my year of retirement, so hope things are good then. Anyway, moving forward, what I'd like to do is just highlight 2019-20 for you right now. So the trustees a number of years ago expressed an appetite to carry an accumulated surplus available for compliance in the neighborhood of $10 million. And that's represented by the green horizontal dashed line running across the graph. If you look at the 2019-20 set of columns, the red bar is really about what we anticipated our accumulated surplus to be at the end of the 2019-20 school year, back in September. So we are anticipating having an accumulated surplus available for compliance of $1.9 million. If the year materializes as we are currently forecasting, the blue bar represents really what our posture will look like. And as you can see, you look at all those red bars representing the plan that as of September 2019, it was going to take us 5 years to get to that targeted $10 million surplus available for compliance. According to financial forecast number 3, it would appear, with all things being equal, that we will achieve that targeted $10 million surplus available for compliance at the end of August 31st, and it will continue to grow. There's a lot of assumptions, of course, for the next 5 years correspondingly. So I think that just really puts it in stark relief about how quickly things can change, and the fact that now it's going to be a different conversation, perhaps, about the sort of long-range financial planning for the district. So moving on to the final slide, the summary. First of all, financial forecast number 3 anticipates a $6.6 million surplus, up from the $2 million surplus previously indicated in financial forecast number 2. It's primarily related to schools being shut down since March break and the related scale back of student transportation activities. This surplus also includes the assumption that $1.4 million of rural and northern education funds will be deferred to 2021, and that only $0.75 million in SIP funding will materialize for the 1920 fiscal year. And part of the reason why I highlight that concept of deferring the rural and northern education fund revenue is because if we grow a surplus of $6.6 million, we end the year with a surplus of $6.6 million. It's important to understand that $6.6 million, though it shows up as our surplus available for compliance, once we cross into the 2021 school year, that from a practical standpoint becomes inaccessible to us. So it's not money that we can then spend unless the board's willing to spend itself into a deficit position in the next fiscal year, in which case that surplus would get drawn down to compensate for the deficit. But it's really not a windfall that we can tap into once we cross into September, and therefore this concept of we only have limited pots of funding that we can elect to defer, and the choice to actually recommend deferral of the rural and northern education funds is to do what we can to, or take the opportunities we can to put that funding to work in the next fiscal year, recognizing that the uncertainty that we're going to experience in next year is going to be further amplified compared to what we would normally face. Further, the same is true for SIP funding. So if the remaining SIP funding comes in 1920, it really becomes attributed to the 1920 accumulated surplus available for compliance, and is not something that we can access in 2021. So it will have the effect of building on the accumulated surplus available for compliance. So the summary here is it's a very, I think, probably compared to where we were last year, a very different set of problems and opportunities to have on our plate. But all things being equal, I think that the financial situation for the board, narrowly viewed from a financial standpoint, we're confident that we're going to be in a comfortable surplus situation at the end of the fiscal year. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Superintendent Hobbs. Trustees, do you have any questions?
I have a question.
I have a question or two, Mr. Chair. John McRae.
All right. Trustee Cran?
That was Trustee McPherson, sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Trustee McPherson, go ahead.
Thank you. The SIP funding, if we do receive that in the next fiscal year, given that it is special education funding and as such is enveloped strictly for special education purposes, are we able to count it towards our accumulated surplus? Just a question.
Through you, Mr. Chair, my understanding is that because we currently overspend the actual strictly envelope spec ed funding in an amount that exceeds the actual SIP funding, then the SIP funding, should we receive it, would be able to be counted towards the accumulated surplus.
Thank you.
Questions?
I have a question, Mr. Chair. John McRae.
Go ahead, Trustee McRae.
Thank you. Jeremy, on page 4, there's a projected increase of secondary students, and I'm wondering what, if any, financial or operational impact there is to the foreign students that are coming to the Bravo and Cornwall high schools in this year, but maybe that would indicate what we might expect in whatever happens next fall. Thank you.
Through you, Mr. Chair. I think that, there's unquestionably a financial impact associated with the loss of tuition-paying students. I think there are a couple things that mitigate that the trustee may be interested in. The first is that in this fiscal year, the actual, how should we say this, curtailment of some of the operations of the Upper Canada Leger Centre and the International Education Program has already been factored into our forecast. So any kind of detrimental financial result has been really modeled out by UCLC staff, and we've already incorporated that into our forecast. For next year, actually, we've already begun, as you may recall from one of my previous conversations about budget, for 2021, our initial very preliminary modeling of what the budget situation is going to look like is already factoring in a dramatically reduced international contingent from UCLC. I mean, it could get there could be fewer, but we've actually I think it's actually cut by almost 70% in terms of what our starting year enrollment numbers were. And again, we can accommodate that. I think another factor I think that's important is that the actual UCLC group as an independent entity they've done a good job, I think, of setting for themselves pretty significant financial contingencies that are able to cover off financial contingencies. And I think part of the rationale for that is not just the financial impact for the organization, but going back a number of years, I think for me at the table when international education became a major area of focus and interest for the organization, the principal thrust to it at the time was not so much about the financial gain, even though that's material and significant. But really it was about actually enriching our schools and our communities with sort of diversity that can only be had by that kind of experience. So I think there's certainly, I think that's front of mind for us, even as we plan for the financial impacts and also the strategies we use to mitigate the financial impact. So the moral of the story really is, I think we're very confident that we can preserve the best of our ability, the diversity that comes with the international education students, and also mitigate the financial impact.
Chair, that's a good answer. I have a second question, if I may.
Sure, go ahead.
Thank you. On page 5, there's an $800,000 reduction in centrally charged instructional staff, and that's, of course, increased and contributed to the surplus. My question is, what is the total expenditure for centrally charged instructional staff at Upper Canada?
Well, these through you, Mr. Chair, my understanding is that this $800,000 is really related to a decrease in centrally charged supply staff, so not necessarily reduction in regular instructional staff. The actual total number is something I don't have handy right now, so I'd have to bring that back, if you wouldn't mind.
Thank you.
Through you, Chair?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Trustee Schooler, I understand the importance of an organization having a surplus, but I'm wondering, is there a standard that has been established for school boards as to what that surplus, the ceiling that surplus should have? Perhaps, it's a percentage of the annual budget for the board. And I ask the question because I see that in the 25-26 projection, if I'm reading this correctly, there's a surplus of almost $20 million, basically $20 million. And when I think of education as a piece of the financial pie for the entire province, recognizing that the province is in rather dire financial straits, I'm just wondering if we have a $20 million surplus of taxpayers' money, how we justify having surplus in light of all factors that are considered when trying to run the province. So my question is, how do we determine, or how is it determined what a board's surplus should be? What is the ceiling?
Mr. Chair, it's Jeremy. I look to your direction as to whether you'd like me to weigh in on that or someone else.
Well, if I could just weigh in a little bit, it should be noted that last year we had a $11.7 million deficit. Now we seem to be going towards a surplus, and it's very fluid. I think the bottom line is that we are looking at, as one of the slides showed, a 3% surplus, I think that's my interpretation of it. That's 3% of total revenue. So we were not there before. We are there now, or at least we're very close there, and that's good news. But I will leave that to other greater minds than mine to elaborate on.
Mr. Chair, may I?
Yes, Trustee McDonald.
Yeah, you're correct, Mr. Chair, with the 3%. So you see the green line is our target of $10 million roughly to reach, and the 3% is something that we have put in place with a motion, but we have also had the recommendation previously. So from a good fiscal standpoint, we believe that having a 3% surplus would help put the board in a better position. And for that, we really are moving towards that. And in some cases, yeah, we're moving faster than we anticipated. But we would also change strategy if we were going to be going even further. So, the blue is projected. And when we look at where we're going to be based on the plan that we wanted to achieve, we were basically working within the orange section. So when we make those adjustments on whatever we decide it to be, or whatever it ends up being at the result of our financial statements, then we can certainly come back and make those adjustments. But from our standpoint, our target has been to achieve the 3% surplus for the board.
Thank you, Trustee McDonald. Any questions?
I do have a question, though, for Superintendent Hobbs, if I could.
By all means, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The question, I have two questions, actually. When we look at the surplus with an assumption of $1.4 million for rural Northern, when did we receive those funds, and how did they get distributed to the board?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I believe those funds were in the fall time frame became available first, and then there was some conversation throughout the year, as I understand, going back to financial forecast number 1 about the choice to defer or expense. And then, moving on as we got further into the year, there was a decision for us to move that back into revenue because in the February-March time frame, we felt that we could, without a job action and that kind of thing, come up with a plan to spend that money in the fiscal year. And then, of course, COVID struck, which has put a halt to that.
And so how did the funds come through? Were they EPO grants, or they're not EPOs now, but
part of the regular GSN?
So regular GSN, so we would have received that based on the GSN announcement last spring?
That's my understanding, yes.
Okay, so, I have the concern that if we get funding through GSN and we still have no plan in the fall, and then we want to defer the revenue, and then we bring the revenue back in, we've had funds on our books potentially are available to be able to spend. So, if we're passing a budget this year, I think we need to be cognizant of what the money is going to be spent on, and we need to have a clear understanding as a board that the money that is going to be allocated to different projects actually has a plan in place, because I don't want to see this situation again where we're having to defer revenue. I mean, from our standpoint as trustees, it's important for us to see that the money that we get without the funds being allocated for our surplus, the money that we're getting is going to be used for kids. And if we had an opportunity to implement this in the fall, based on the GSNs that were announced, why didn't we? And I think we need to have further discussion on that, trustees. That's a concern that I have. My second question is around the SIP, and even though I think we've anticipated a 0.75, so $750,000, we haven't received the funds. So how can we defer revenue if we haven't received it?
To you, Mr. Chair, actually, we're not proposing to defer SIP funds. So SIP funds would, when they're eventually received, they would be booked against 1920 and would become part of the accumulated surplus for 1920. So there really is, as we understand, no option to defer those funds once they eventually arrive.
So if we receive, I guess let me clarify then. So as we get money for SIP, because the cycle period seems to be long, as we get the funds for SIP every year, it will go against an accumulated surplus because we are overspending on special education until we reach that point.
That's my understanding.
Okay.
The alternative, I believe, again, through you, Mr. Chair, I believe the alternative would be that if we I think, had a cycle of SIP under our belt and felt comfortable that we were going to be successful in getting 100% or 90% of the amount, we would then be comfortable for the subsequent year to say, okay, we can budget now an additional, $3.1 million, or we can budget, instead of $750,000, we could budget the full amount at the start of the year as revenue, as long as we are comfortable and we had the experience to suggest that we are going to eventually get that funding in the fiscal year.
And just to follow up, if I may, Mr. Chair, is it consistent? I know there's a long cycle, but is it consistent when the funds are distributed for SIP funding? Like, is it every fall or is it every spring? Because then we can start to build that into our plan. If we know when the funds are going to come, that can be worked into our budget in a way that we would, I guess, acknowledge the revenue that would be coming in the given year so that we can actually have a in-year spend for it.
Through you, Mr. Chair, my understanding in the past has been that it's really any time from summer into the fall. So really, the whole, I think, idea is that you'd have to, develop the comfort that it's going to be eventually received and received in an amount that you're anticipating, and then you would go ahead and spend it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Are there any further questions? Hearing none, the Superintendent Hobbs, thank you very much for your presentation. I feel that we are in good hands. You have presented us with some good news and some potentially great news. Having said that, we have not received the GSN announcement yet, which we anticipate daily. And anyway, just keep those blue bars coming. Thank you.
Thank you.
Trustees, I'm going to move now to 1206, which is the Director of Education's work plan and status report number 3. Director, I'll turn this over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you, my pleasure to bring to trustees this update report on the third of 4 updates to the board regarding the status of the Director's work plan. Just as a reminder to members of the board that the work plan is a response by staff to the board's own work plan and the goals that the board has set. And you'll see in your agenda package this evening a reminder of what the overarching work plan goals the board has set for itself this year, and therefore how the Director's work plan is in response to that. This evening, Superintendent Coombs will be assisting me because we'll have a specific drill down on one of the goals, which is our graduation rate goal of 90% for a couple of reasons, Mr. Chair. Reason number one is that as we wrap up the school year, it's certainly clear to understand for us as staff that the board would have some direct interest in what is our projection of the graduation rate at this juncture of the school year, and then in our fourth report to the board to close off or bookend projections with some actual numbers. And what actual numbers do we have at this time that we can reference and share at the board? Secondly, that there were, as you know, Mr. Chair, from the previous report, this was an extraordinary year, both with work to rule escalations and disruptions on the labor front, and as well then the novel coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic in March. That has, in some ways, impacted the staff's ability to pursue some specific actions that are paused right now. And only over the last 2 weeks are we getting ourselves back on track and seeing what we can do that before the September final report to the board to see whether or not those actions can be put into motion and therefore to leverage outcomes that we hope will achieve the goals that we're seeking. As well, Mr. Chair, while it's been an extraordinary year, there has been some movement. Even since this particular report was filed in the agenda on Friday afternoon. An example would be in checking with and doing a walkthrough with senior staff this week. Board will recall that the district-wide timetable actions that are part of goal number one and actions supporting goal number one have actually been achieved, as the board had heard in its meeting on June 3rd. And in some instances, there has been some movement on some other key actions that are to realize goals that we have, for example, in goal number 5, and in terms of increasing student impressions about being closer to accessing the supports and services that they need. Trustees will recall that at the board meeting on the 27th of May, Student Trustee Kelford and I brought forward a report to the board that was about asking students' experiences about accessing key resources and supports through the Student Senate. We were able to report back to the board about that. And what that meant is that we moved from a beginning to a progressing level on that action, which gets us closer to, of course, realizing a goal that we have of helping students to see that we're trying to make them, to create for them, I should say, a connection to those resources that they say matters and counts in their learning. Finally, Mr. Chair, what's really important is that even though there is this set of constraints that nobody was anticipating around the scale of the labor disruption followed by the scale of the global pandemic, we did find opportunities as a staff to pursue and persist in the goals and actions that the work plan is attending to both at the board and the staff level. And an example of that, Mr. Chair, is I want to draw to the trustees' attention that goal number 1, which is the focus on the graduation rate, and that to increase the June 2020 cohort graduation rate to 90% for this year and identify the strategies to sustain this level of success. It happens to also be a focus that we have during the continuity of learning and distance learning strategy that we've had in place for over 4 months, where members of the board will recall that we've committed to a goal that each and every one of our secondary school students we will bring across the line in order for them to earn their credits this year in spite of the disruption of the pandemic. So in that case, we have instances where we could find alignment, immediate alignment in the goals that the board had set pre-pandemic and the goals that the operational staff are pursuing during this period of the pandemic. So, Mr. Chair, through you, lastly, in the fourth report that will come to the board will be not so much a highlight or a spotlight on a particular goal or set of goals as the last two reports have been, but in fact a full comprehensive report back on where the staff has landed by the beginning of the new school year in our efforts to discharge fully the different actions and how we believe it's going to make an impact on the goals that the board has set. So, Mr. Chair, at this point, I'm going to invite Superintendent Coombs, who has the student success portfolio and has reported back to the board before on the graduation rate, to comment on where we're fixed at goal 1 in terms of our projection and in terms of the material you'll see both in the summary report attached to this evening's agenda and in the landing page report detailing about goal number 1, grade 12 graduation rate of 90%. So over to Mr. Coombs then, Mr. Chair, and from there we'll see what questions trustees may have.
Thank you very much, Director, and through you, Mr. Chair. Could you hear me okay?
Yes, we can, Mr. Coombs. Thank you.
Thanks so much, and good evening, everybody. I'm pleased to have this opportunity to talk about our 2020 graduation rate. Every time I do talk about this work, I always have to mention that there is a bit of an asterisk over all our numbers. We track them in real time. We update them on a week-by-week and then sometimes day-by-day basis. However, we won't get our official graduation rate from the Ministry of Education until several months after this school year. So we're always fighting a bit of a lag, fighting some lag data, but we do our best to make sure that we have found all the students that are applicable to our cohort and that we can then track them down, engage them, and put in place the kind of supports necessary, both at the system at the school level, to ensure that they get over the line. We began this 2020 cohort in September of 2015 with 1,952 grade 9 students beginning their secondary journey with the Upper Canada School Board. 19 of those students have left Ontario or the country, so they get removed from our cohort and no longer count towards that graduation rate, leaving 1,933 students in our adjusted cohort. We can say that we have 1,455 graduates after 4 years, and that's about a 75% graduation rate after 4 years of that cohort. That's up slightly from previous years. We have been in the 72 to 73% range before, so while that is good news, certainly that is something that we would like to adjust upwards. I can tell you between, of this fifth-year cohort, these students who began with us in September of 2015, 38 graduated between September 1st and March 13th. And the reason why I use that as a demarcation line, of course, is because that's when we began our remote learning quite suddenly. And while it certainly has been an obstacle, as Director Sliwa has outlined, and certainly I don't think we need to go into any greater detail of what that has meant, it also has presented some opportunities. The Ministry of Education has adjusted its growing success document and adjusted some requirements for graduation purposes, such as waiving the literacy requirement and also waiving the 40 hours community service. We were well positioned because we had graduation coaches already connected with our fifth-year and fourth-year cohort students to call them up and engage them quickly and to say that if you believe that you were just behind your graduation, it could be closer than you think. And in fact, we've started a social media campaign around that theme, graduation is closer than you think. And so this data, which I believe is in your summary package, talks that between March 13th and June 1st, we had 46 graduates. I can say just in the past 16 days, we have had an additional 16 graduates. So we have a total of 100 students in September in that fifth-year cohort who have graduated. So our grad coaches and our SST, our student success teams in our schools, are working perhaps never more than during this pandemic time to reach out, to connect, and to assist those students in crossing the line with these opportunities. Now, I also point out, of course, that students who leave our board and go to a coterminous board or another board within Ontario still count towards our graduation rate. Historically, over the past 3 or 4 years, they've graduated at a 65 or 66%. So we are estimating that of the students who left us, 93 of those will graduate. That leaves us with an estimated graduation rate in 2020 of 87.4%. Again, I can't emphasize it enough. There is an asterisk beside this because lots could happen between now and the end of summer. And of course, we do have an enhanced summer school program that we are certainly advertising and encouraging all our students to engage in. If we just look at those students that stayed with Upper Canada, we are estimating around an 89% graduation rate. Again, I do want to make it clear, that's not how the ministry records its graduation rate. All students who began with us in 2015, including those who leave us, still count. And again, this is ongoing work, and every week, in fact, every day, I get another notification about graduates, and it's certainly good to see that during this time of pandemic and remote learning, we still have actively engaged graduation coaches, teachers, guidance counselors, and administrators reaching out and engaging some of our most at-risk students. That's all for me, and certainly I would be happy to take any questions at this time.
Thank you, Secretary Coombs. Trustees, would you have any questions?
I have a question for Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, Trustee McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question for the Director, if we, based on the results, we're at 87.4 for the estimate. It's, you know, we've done some good work between March 13th, not 31st, and June 1st to get us to, you know, to realize 46 of those students. But we're still short 1,700 students, if I'm looking at this correctly on the chart. So, you know, we're not going to hit our target, what we wanted to do. So how are we going to ensure that that we're going to hit the target? Like, what's the difference maker going to be in 2020, 2021 to achieve 90%?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's an excellent question, and through you, there's a number of different steps that we're taking, and I think that we do believe that, first of all, the site-based graduation coaches have just sort of realizing their potential. There was certainly a lag during the labor disruption that did not allow us to engage and network at the level that we are now. And even in that short period of time, I know that Mr. Coombs has been providing us updates since the end of March to where we are now, that we are seeing a material difference. So number one, Mr. Chair, would be to further embed the work of the site-based graduation coaches in a coordinated way with our district resources, to continue to keep a close eye on the students who we are tracking and not to lose sight or touch with them. Secondly, Mr. Chair, of equal importance as well is that we're finding workarounds with regards to students who responded best to that consistency and continuity of connection with students in the face-to-face environments, which is our primary model that we were using, and whether we're talking about our TR Leger continuing education programs or whether it was through our regular day school. What we've found and what we're establishing is a parallel process, and I know Mr. Coombs could speak a bit more about that, about what does it mean to actually track and connect and stay in touch with students, where we've lost really what has been a primary advantage of daily face-to-face contact with that caring teacher. Thirdly, Mr. Chair, what we believe is going to continue to make a difference, and we've had a initial implementation of this and some positive feedback in terms of the efforts to do that, is to be building alternative-like learning centers in our secondary or mainstream secondary schools that are replicating the very flexible program delivery approach that has been very successful for TR Leger, that continues to follow students who left TR Leger to return to their home-based day school environment and to continue to grow and to keep them connected with their learning. As you heard this evening, Mr. Chair, one of our greatest variables that is not possible for us to influence is when we have a cohort count that includes students that began in the Upper Canada District School Board but leave the care and monitoring of the school district because the students have either moved to a different school district or have moved out of district. And that will always be a variable that could have implications for us, regardless of how we set this stretch goal of 90%. And it's an aspirational goal. It's a goal absolutely that we're committed to as a staff. However, it's one that's always going to be challenged by the basis of we have students that leave our care and therefore outside of our ability to influence their decisions about working with us. Lastly, Mr. Chair, if I may mention, in a previous report to the board, you may recall that we're also tracking our graduation rates in a more expanded way beyond a specific school year to actually to when students are 21 years of age. And I say that because we have a number of students that come back for, quote unquote, we've heard victory laps. That may not necessarily mean a fifth year. It may be beyond that. It may be a sixth year, and that students can still be received in day school and TR Leger programs as part of their diploma program and being under 21. We also have had some need to continue to do that tracking. And in fact, we could certainly confirm that we've moved the needle on what that cohort was if in fact we use a different benchmark of not a June graduation date, but at age 21, where students no longer are part of a regular day school system experience. And we think that we also, by that way, can show that we are keeping tabs on those students and are honoring the objective, the goal that the board has set. Mr. Chair, I'll turn that back over to you.
Just, Mr. Chair, follow up?
Yes, you may.
Thank you. So the ministry has a definition, though, and it's at 5 years. So I understand it would be nice to do those types of things, but, you know, I come back to this. If our goal is to meet the ministry guideline or the ministry definition of graduation within that 5 year period, in fact, we should be striving for 4 years, very honestly, right? Our success is based on how well a student can do while they are in the stream of high school with us. And if we say we need more years to make sure this student is successful, it has an indication of what we're doing as an organization as well. So, you know, I think we need to be cautious on how far we want to move the finish line, because we also want to make sure that students are successful in the majority of the time that they're with us. When you make the statement of some students leaving, and I see that there's 19 students that have left the province, how many students have left our board and gone to other boards? Because conversely, we also have students that are coming into our board that those other boards are relying on us to be successful with those students. So, you know, how many students are impacted by leaving Upper Canada, but then staying in the province and going to other boards? Do we have that number?
Mr. Chair, that's a good question. I'll ask to see if Mr. Coombs can comment on that.
Yes, through you, Mr. Chair. My understanding of the question is how many students have left our board to stay in Ontario and go to another board. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yes. I'm sorry. I don't have that data right now, but I could certainly produce that by this time next week.
Okay, thank you. And I think it's relevant because if we're saying that, you know, we are measured based on the impact of students leaving our board going to other boards, but yet we don't have direct contact with them, then it's important for us to understand is that, are we, you know, having hundreds of kids or is it, you know, single digit numbers? Then we've got other things that we need to look at. So,
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair. That was my mistake. I misunderstood that question. If I may, I believe the question was how many leave. So 66%. When I estimate 66% completion rate, which is the historical rate, those that leave us, that equates to 93 students or 133 students who have left our board.
Okay. So, you know, that's a small number compared to what we need to achieve to get, you know, 1740. So if we look at a 1740, it's really in reality 1840 if we're going to do that math, right? If we assume a child leaves our board and moves to another board, you know, we hope and we want to think that they're going to be successful, but that means that we've got to make sure that we put extra effort in place to make sure that all of our students are successful. My question, Mr. Chair, is back to the director, is we have strategies in place. We have a budget that's coming up. Do we have a direct plan associated with costing that's going to be involved in the budget to ensure that we are going to be successful at our 90%, and keeping in mind that we don't know what school startup looks like. So, you know, we talked about having some virtual pieces associated to right now. Have we also built that into the plan for what, you know, potentially could be in place come September?
Mr. Chair, through you, yes, again, excellent question. We are doing that forecasting in terms of the kinds of resources that we believe that we need, and we will have some asks of the board that we would factor into their budgeting discussion, because the trustee is quite correct, Mr. Chair. There are actually two realities that the board is needing to tool up for. One is of course its regular day school environment, and yet as you'll hear in the next report, since the reopening of what a regular day school environment and what would constitute regular is really still being defined. We have to continue to grow and develop our distance learning strategy, and Mr. Chair, as you heard in the report to the board on, I believe, June 3rd, when the district-wide timetable came forward, we continue to build that district learning team muscle, I guess you could say, now, and with some projected requests for the future, because I do think that is certainly the next level of work in terms of supporting students who may actually find through this experience that they prefer that mode of learning and has been very successful for them. And we have some success stories there. And we also know that we are also trying to repurpose some of our current assets, for example, how we're using our grad coaches under Mr. Coombs' care to be more nimble or versatile, to be thinking about how we're reaching students when we don't actually have the convenience of having them in a particular school at a particular time, where we can schedule those appointments and make those crucial connections with them. So long answer short, Mr. Chair, yes on both counts, and I think the board can expect that there'll be some requests forthcoming.
I have a related question. I'm primarily interested in the 19 and 38 figures. The 19 students who are on track to graduate and the 38 students who are at risk to graduate. Let's assume for a moment that all 57 of those students were successful. Where would that put our graduation rate?
Mr. Chair, I'll ask Superintendent Coombs to comment.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chair. So we're estimating we would, now this is a ministry graduation rate, would move us into just under 89% if everybody graduated. And I was estimating a 50% completion rate for those students. But if it did, it would put us in striking distance, but not quite there.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Hearing none. Thank you, Superintendent Coombs and Director Slaylock, for your report. Is there anything to add that I've missed?
Mr. Chair, not from our staff. Thank you.
Thank you. I will now move to 1207, which is the UCDSB Operations Management Priorities and Practices Coronavirus COVID-19, June 17, 2020. I'll turn this over to you, Director.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and again, thank you, trustees, for the opportunity to bring this report to you. This evening's update really is starting to focus more on that tomorrow mindset that I raised with the board at the last report, which was we were juggling both a today mindset, what's happening in schools and in-school programs across the district during this period of the pandemic, and also trying to maintain some operational priorities while building towards a tomorrow mindset about getting prepared for next fall and the program year of 2020-2021. So, Mr. Chair, as you know, what is top of mind right now is two things: how we close off this year successfully for what students and their families need, and how we how we prepare for the school reopening, and what our strategy and direction will be in light of the fact that we know that the province is also investing in considerations and direction regarding school reopening. We know that the Ontario Public School Board Trustee Association has provided advice and guidance to the Ministry of Education and to the Minister about what some of those key considerations are. And I think what you'll see this evening, Mr. Chair, in tonight's briefing to the board is that there's starting to be a number of similarities between what's being discussed at the trustee table provincially and locally, what's being discussed at the Ministry of Education, and what our senior team and leadership work teams involving principals, district managers, key staff who have highly specific or specified assignments, and the superintendent table, what we're talking about, there's starting to be a very clear connection between those three dialogues. Let's begin, Mr. Chair, if you don't mind, with the what's in top of mind today as it relates to school closures, school grounds, and the planning underway with regards to access to schools. And I'm going to ask if Superintendent McNair can speak about that. In her school operation role, Superintendent McNair has a key coordination role that she works with other superintendents, other portfolios, and certainly the wide array of schools that we have to make sure that these key areas are being addressed. So I'll just ask Superintendent McNair to speak to the school operation pieces that are part of the landing page report this evening in Section 1. So over to her.
Thank you, Director Sliwa. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you, Superintendent. Please proceed.
Through you, Chair. Good evening, everyone. So the first topic I will speak about is school closure. So as you know, our schools are still closed to the public. We have had some recent access protocols approved from our two local health units that have permitted us to allow families or students to access our school. It is happening this week for retrieval of student belongings, and from all reports thus far, our access started yesterday. Things are going very smoothly and very well, and families and students are very happy to retrieve their belongings. And of course, our school staff have been very happy to see some of these faces and greet them and wish them well as they head off into the summer. Our staff have also had the opportunity with accessing the school to retrieve their personal belongings to close out the year. In terms of the school ground, we have information received recently from Public Health that the outdoor fields have been permitted to open, but still our playground structures have been to remain closed at this time. So we await further guidance on next steps as it pertains to our playground structures. We also have started this past week, we have office staff that have returned to school sites to support the year-end administrative tasks. These office staff would include elementary and secondary office administrators, office assistants, and financial assistants, so that we can certainly end out the school year with addressing the essential tasks that are before us, which would be similar to any other year. Things may look a little bit differently at school sites. The school sites, again, are not open to the public, but we do have staff in the building, in the office, addressing these needs. And then lastly, under school operations at this time, our principals and school staff have been coordinating and participating in various elementary school leaving activities, as well as grade 12 secondary graduation celebrations. So those activities began somewhat probably late last week into early this week, and will continue the remainder of this week and into next week. And I'm hoping that you have been hearing from your principals so that you are aware of some of the activities that have been arranged for students, whether they're in grade 6 and 8 leaving ceremonies, or whether it be our grade 12 celebration ceremonies for our graduates. At this time, I think that would be my report, Director Sliwa.
Thank you, Superintendent McNair.
So, Mr. Chair, if I may, I'll just continue with the last part of the briefing to the board, and we'll see if there's questions for any of the staff. We've got all of our superintendents, business superintendents, and of course, our health and safety officer on the line as well, if there's any questions. The second part of tonight's briefing, Mr. Chair, happens to be about the draft executive summary that's attached to tonight's report. Now, this is a very fluid document, and it's still taking shape as we speak. The 40 people work teams that we have, leadership work teams that are helping to assemble our reopening strategies, continue to meet this week. They've been meeting over the last 3 weeks. And Mr. Chair, what you see here is a compilation of their very rough cut of their first piece of work, which is more than, at this point, 36 pages. And you've got the top 7, which is an overview about where things are at. What I want to draw to the attention of trustees this evening, Mr. Chair, is really the 4 assumptions that we're working with right now in building this plan that actually resonates with just about everything that we're hearing from public health, other jurisdictions that are already in a school reopening mode, and how we can learn from them, as well as most recently as today, some recommendations and guidelines for the reopening of schools from the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto, who happens to be a very key collaborator with the Ministry of Education around building guidance surrounding the reopening of schools, of which that information and direction we expect is imminent. The 4 assumptions, Mr. Chair, that I just want to highlight for the board tonight is that our first assumption is that we anticipate that any move forward, whether it comes from operating a school system or whether it's operating an office, is that there's a de-intensification of workspaces and classroom spaces such that there are less people present in these settings. And why that's important, Mr. Chair, is that we have one of 2 options. One is to have less people present to be able to have the proper social distancing, and where that's not possible, then to be looking at other measures, other contingencies that might include facial coverings or whatever it might be recommended. And we're waiting for that, of course, that definitive direction from public health, but again, the Hospital for Sick Children's recommendations, which we just received today and was just published today, will be very helpful, very influential to our work that we're doing. Our second assumption also resonates with that report from the Hospital for Sick Children and including from our public health units, that they have been very vigorous in reinforcing this, is that there'll be an intensification of hygiene and cleaning practices where people are present. Again, to point to that most recent report from the Hospital for Sick Children, much of their focus is about the stepped-up cleaning that you've heard Superintendent Hobbs speak to in previous reports that have been part of our focus when either we're opening a community-based resource like a emergency daycare, or whether we're opening our offices or our board office on a very limited measure for essential work, and we know that we have people present. The third assumption, Mr. Chair, of the four is that we all understand that there's going to be a greater presence of remote learning and distance learning opportunities for all students, that we understand that that is what you had seen as a board of trustees, what we have seen as a staff coming from the province of Ontario already with their framework for distance learning that speaks to fluency, they call it, of learning, involving students being able to move from learning that's happening in a face-to-face, in-person environment in schools to being able to switch over to distance learning without any major loss of time in that child's learning experience. And very lastly, Mr. Chair, the fourth assumption that's driving our planning right now as a staff is also resonating out there in the larger public domain, of course, is the continuity of learning for all students, regardless of the circumstances, includes capacities to continue their learning, whether there's a need to close a classroom or a school, or whether the school district would be closed by a ministerial order. And again, that's a key driver coming from the province, and what we've learned ourselves over the last 4 months is that the province, our school board, our schools have placed as a priority keeping the learning going for our students, because we know that there is very detrimental adverse effects when children disconnect from their learning and disconnect from the socialization of learning as well. So tonight, Mr. Chair, the board will see that so far in our very rough cut, of which this executive summary gives a good overview of those 35, 36 pages that the staff have developed so far, that the reopening strategy is based on looking at 7 key operational areas, building on the recommendation of 9 operational areas that we saw in the anchor paper, and we saw places where we could blend or combine those conversations into 7 specific operational areas, that there are very clear set of focus that we are looking at as a work team, and that we'll be bringing to our schools next week. And in bringing this draft plan to schools next week, also thinking that we'll have the perfect opportunity to dovetail our local work with what will be the provincial direction, to update our local plan, and then to build our contingencies forward with that plan. I should also say, Mr. Chair, lastly, just to see before you have any questions from the board, is that in our moving from thinking to planning to doing, there are some cases where the planning and the doing are already underway. And I know that we can give examples of that as simple as outfitting the board office for being prepared to receive the public in the near future by having a plexiglass shield in the front lobby. That would be just one small example of how the planning and the doing is already emerging at this point, and we know that we have a lot of work to do as a staff to get prepared for the new school year and whatever direction the province provides in terms of school reopening. So, Mr. Chair, I'll turn that back over to you and see if trustees have any questions for the staff, and we look forward to entertaining any of those questions.
Thank you, Director. It should be understood that all of this planning is done in anticipation of a more direction from the province, which we anticipate soon. Trustees, do you have any questions?
I do. Trustee Swan?
Go ahead, Trustee Swan.
I'd first like to state a comment. I just want to thank all our principals, senior administrators, or IT. The cleaning up the lockers, I participated with my son today. He had a 15-minute time slot. It was easy to book. I even had to reschedule. It was still easy to cancel and reschedule. He was in and out in the 15, dead on pretty much, so they timed it well, and the kids were social distanced. And in one end of the school, out the other, they did an excellent job, and I was so happy that there wasn't any dead food in there or anything walking. So I just want to commend them for the scheduling and everything they did to make this run as smooth as it did. And I heard some other positives from parents in the parking lot as well. So thank you. My question is, as we get updates from the ministry, and I did read the document from Sick Kids today, will we be a part of this discussion as a board of trustees on how we can support these kids if it's more of an e-learning, or if e-learning's incorporated into this module more than it has been in the past when they're in school full time? That's my question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for that question, Trustee Swan. I'll ask trustees to recall the presentation from Superintendent Rudders at the beginning of June, when she reported out on the district-wide timetable and the very fortuitous carryovers that the board has been investing in since 2018, and how that's having a direct and immediate benefit for our planning right now. Trustees may recall that part of that presentation that evening was working on a more robust distance learning strategy. And as you heard this evening, staff will be bringing to the board some budgetary requests that we believe will also enhance and expand that, because it is an area of the board that is active, has been very successful in the past. The scale, however, has changed dramatically, and we do continue to plan to build around that capacity of what will be both the board and the provincial expectation for that quote-unquote fluency, where families can move back and forth from being at a school in a physical presence to being able to then resort back to online learning if, in fact, a school, a classroom, or, in fact, the board cannot function due to a public health direction. So I'm happy to say that more dialogue to come about that, especially beginning at the budget table.
Just to follow up.
Go ahead.
So at the budget table, then we could possibly, or I would hope to see, then we might have some budget discussions about additional funding for supports for students in need if they aren't in school, or potential monies there put aside in case these students need it that are not having huge success in distance learning.
I think this is where I jump in, Trustee Swan. I would say yes, that is where the discussion is going to take place.
Okay, thank you. I just want to make sure we don't lose this discussion.
No, and I would also say that it's a good question for my discussion with the minister privately or publicly, which I will bring to his attention.
Thank you.
Any further questions?
I have a question, Mr. Chair. John McRae.
Go ahead, Trustee McRae.
Thank you. Under assumption number 1, it's been suggested in some quarters that there may be a shortage of portables if we go to discrete learning on site. And I just want to put that out there as something when you have your discussions, that that's a possibility to consider. Under the second assumption, I'm wondering if there's been discussions of retrofitting schools for foot-operated washing stations and in washrooms. And the third and last point is under assumption number 4. Has there been discussions in places about partnering, collaborating with outside agencies for such as the health unit, such as the province, such as daycare providers to share space and share costs, and perhaps if it's to do with the well-being of students and staff health-wise, sharing some of the responsibilities? I throw that out there, Mr. Chair, not necessarily as a question, just so much as a comment. Thank you.
Trustee McCray, it will be noted, if that's satisfactory with you.
Indeed it is.
Thank you. Any other questions and comments? Seeing none, I'm going to move to, thank you very much, Director Sewa and Superintendent McNair and Executive Superintendent Hobbs and Health and Safety Specialist Dennis Kolak. Okay? Thank you very much. So we're going to move to 1401, which is the report to the board from private session. At its Committee of the Whole meeting in private session, May 27, 2020, one personnel matter was discussed and no recommendations were brought forward to the board. 1402, at its Committee of the Whole special meeting in private session, June 10, 2020, one personnel matter was discussed and one recommendation was brought forward to the board. It's moved by Trustee Jacob, seconded by Trustee McPherson. If anyone objects to that, let me know. That the board approved resolution number PS 2020 June 10 002, carried in Committee of Whole private session under agenda item D1 June 10, 2020. Any discussion? If not, please cast your ballot.
Mr. Chair, that motion carried.
Thank you. We will move to Article 1501, which is a notice of motion brought by myself, and I'm going to turn the chair over to Vice Chair McPherson to chair this, please.
Thank you. Okay. You have a notice of motion in regards to proposed changes to Health 122 transportation. Have two attachments. One is the notice of motion, and the second one is both amendments. It would be my understanding that we acknowledge this. Now, just the procedural question, perhaps Stephen can weigh in. This will actually be dealt with at our next meeting, or is the intent to speak to it tonight and deal with it tonight?
It's not really a notice of motion, Chair, because the notice of motion only applies to bylaws. So it is an action item, and I would like to discuss it this evening.
Okay, so essentially, I'm going to ask you to pull your attachment with the amendments, and I will let Trustee McAllister speak on it.
Thank you, Vice Chair. I don't know if you want me to read the motion, but you have it in front of you. And it's a long-standing concern with regard to transportation. You'll have to bear with me because I have a few comments here to make. And
do you need a seconder?
You want to put a motion on the floor first?
Yes, I would, please.
Okay.
I'll second it. Trustee Swan.
Moved by Trustee McAllister, second by Trustee Swan, that we amend policy number 120, student transportation. Back to you, Trustee McAllister.
Thank you, Vice Chair. I really want to address the issue of transportation. Numerous parental concerns have been brought to me about situations, rulings, and decisions which just do not seem to make sense in some cases. For example, one parent is technically out of boundary by 500 meters or less. The alternative stop, coincidentally, located less than 1 kilometer away at a neighbor's home, which is also out of bounds, but they've been given an exemption based on a side agreement made several years ago. Another parent is in a similar situation in another community. Their life, church, library, recreation, etc., are all based in the nearby town 2 kilometers away. Yet, given their location and out of boundary means that the children, the three of them, would have to attend a school over 20 kilometers away. The added pickup would entail a short extension of an existing route. Another parent wanted his or her daughter to attend a high school and was willing to drive his daughter to a nearby stop en route to that school. Instead, the ruling was that she would have to attend one of the Brockville schools due to established boundaries. Childcare is often a factor for many parents and does not always conform to school boundaries. In another case, if the child was picked up on the same property at a different location, he or she would qualify. And I mean, I have numerous examples, but I'm going to stop at that. I could go on, but my intention as a trustee does not assess blame on either STAO or our board's decisions. These decisions reflect policy and procedure. But to the parents involved in these matters, the result fails the sniff test. There are various levels of appeal already in place, but the results too often fail the test of fairness and common sense. And that is not good for public education. So let me put these scenarios into perspective. A year ago, we had an $11.7 million deficit, largely due to over expenditures in transportation and special education. In regards to the latter, we conducted a spec ed review and are implementing its recommendations, which puts us in a really good place for serving our students and yet managing our resources. In the case of the latter, STAO, via the Upper Canada District School Board and the Catholic District School Board of Eastern Ontario, has enacted a number of efficiency measures which are being phased in presently. So we have been good stewards of the resources allocated to us, and I am proud of what we, the Director and his staff, have accomplished in these two areas. Today, we are now in a different and much more positive place, in spite of this pandemic. We will never resolve every issue, nor should we try. However, the question is this: how can we continue our good stewardship and yet serve our families to the best of our ability in ways which make sense? There are several options. A, we could have a final appeal panel of trustees to adjudicate some of these issues, which is another layer of government, you might say. Or we could, in our budget deliberations, allocate sufficient resources to a transportation contingency fund to accommodate added costs based on the discretion of our director and the informed judgments of his superintendents. The latter option is the most clear and efficient way to handle this issue, in my humble opinion. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the essence of my motion, and I would appreciate your support.
Okay, open the floor to discussion or questions. Hearing none.
I have comments and questions.
Yes, go ahead, Trustee McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to just make sure that we understand the complexity of what's being presented. I truly believe that we have an issue with transportation. I've said it many times before, but I'm not quite certain on the path that's being put forward today. I believe that the motion that's being put forward is actually ultra-virus. It's not a situation that would allow us as a board. What you're doing is you're committing funding on an annual basis in a policy. And if we think about the governance of this board, our budget process is an annual process where we review the amount of revenue that we have versus the expenses that we want to incur, and we make decisions based on that. By putting something in a policy, I think we're overstepping our bounds for future boards to make decisions on budget. And so, having a spending piece in a policy, I don't think is the right way to go. Having said that, I think we need to do something with Steel, and I would suspect that the chair of Steel and the trustee representative of Steel could bring this forward as well. And I think for us, the fact that we have gained efficiencies to the tune of 1.4 million right now, part of that due to COVID, but the funding associated to transportation is a very particular one. You get a certain amount of funding based on the cost of providing the transportation. And in any given year, when I sat on Steel, there is additional funds. And because we've found efficiencies, we find funds at the end of the year that have to be spent. And if we put that money back into a surplus, or if we put that money anywhere, it reduces the amount of revenue we get in the next year. And so I think we need to be cautious about how we put money aside for transportation and make sure that we understand how the ministry will fund us if we have money sitting on the sidelines for transportation. I think we also need to make sure that we understand the implications of the decisions that we've made around trying to get those efficiencies. Everyone that I talk to around transportation concerns is because we have put in place efficiencies that have taken away the ability for students to get to our schools in an easy fashion. We make it very difficult for students to get to our school in the spirit of efficiencies. And so I think what we need to do as well is come back and realize that maybe these efficiencies are what needs to be reviewed again. And maybe we need to have a further review at Steel about how we handle these types of things. I mean, I think, if we look at a road and we say that side of the road is the boundary and this side of the road is this boundary, I mean, the bus drives down the road one way or the other. And I think if we have common sense associated to it, whether it's one side of the road or the other side of the road, children residing on a particular road should be allowed to get that transportation. We've created more problems as a result of trying to be black and white when it comes to interpreting where our boundaries are and what we were doing to try and get efficiency. So I don't want to support this tonight, but what I do want to support is a further review around the efficiency measures that have taken place at Steel. And I want to make sure that we understand the complete funding of transportation. And if trying to put a contingency fund in place or any type of that funding to help offset some of those pieces, will it impact us in a negative light for future funding? And I want to make sure that we understand that before we commit to anything. That's my only ask.
Thank you, Trustee McDonald. Any further comments or questions?
Chair, I have one.
Yes, go ahead, please.
I'm not certain that what's in front of us can be done in one motion. I think it needs to be split. The first part being that sufficient resources, and then the second part being that the policy 120 be revised. If the first part is defeated, there's no reason to have the second part. So I think it needs to be split. And then the discussion can occur, as David McDonald is saying, on putting money into the budget. But to put both of them together, I think causes some difficulty right now. Because the second part should be referred to the policy committee. The first part is passed.
Okay, any feelings on that, John?
I understand that. I have no problem with splitting the motion. It was never really my intention to have two parts to it. My main concern is the first part of the motion.
Yeah.
And I would like to deal with it first and then go to the second part later. Deal with one at a time.
And how would that motion read? I'm looking at the draft.
Well, the first part of the motion would read as it is.
And it strictly involves the funding aspect.
Without the last part, which is further be it resolved.
Okay. Any further comments or questions?
Yes, it's Trustee Swan.
Go ahead, Trustee Swan.
I agree with a lot of the points of Trustee McDonald. I'd like to see it come back to CO. I'd like more discussion. I think these buses going by next door and one's to one school and one's to a school further away, it's just not making any sense, and nor are we attracting people to our schools. But I have a question for either and anyone on the CO board is, how do our rules in regards to this and our boundaries align to the boundaries of the Catholic board that we're sharing the buses with?
Someone have a answer for your question?
Well, I think I could answer that. Our boundaries are much different than the boundaries of the Catholic District School Board because they are a much wider area than ours. We have more schools, therefore we have more boundaries and more issues. I don't think this is a STAO issue, frankly, at this point. I think this is our issue.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, I want to just ask a question though on that part.
Okay, go ahead, please.
I disagree. I think it is a STEO issue because they're the ones who interpret the policy that's in place as far as boundaries go. And if we want to spend more money, we can spend more money, but we can also put in place commentary that allows for that gray area to occur, so that if it is one side of the street versus the other side of the street, it can take place. For us, I don't think it's us as far as taking ownership. I mean, you've said it completely. I mean, the Catholic District School Board zones are totally different than us. Fewer schools, different zones, all that kind of stuff. And I think, the decision really does lie with Theo, and we just give them the direction to make that decision. We're not helping matters if we come back and say it's our decision, because Theo is the one that's enforcing it. We're dealing with the appeal after the effect.
Okay. Go ahead.
But if I could answer that, please. I'm not sure referring to STAO is the issue. The issue is our interpretation of our boundaries, and we expect STAO to do. And sometimes our interpretation that we have imposed on STAO causes us a great deal of concern and causes our parents a great deal of concern. And I frankly, the decisions, because they are respecting the policy and the procedure, they do not make sense. Sometimes. I'm not saying all the time. Obviously not. But sometimes they do not make sense. There are so many gray areas. And I think what my motion is intended to do is to address those gray areas and to to provide us with the opportunity to serve our people as best we can.
Okay.
Can I have a comment, Chair?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Thank you. It's Trustee Danaher speaking. I sit on the Steel Board, and I've been on that board now for about a year and a half, and one of the things that I've learned is that Steel will enforce the policies that they're given. We can blame Steel for whatever we want to in terms of what's happening with the busing, but the reality is they do what the policy tells them to do. And then if there's an issue, it comes back to the board. Who deals with the parental complaints? I'm sure Director Sliwa can spend his time on a lot of better things, and probably a lot of the times he has to. I know myself as a trustee, all the time I get those calls, and I think a lot of us do. And I think the reality is, as John says, it's the humanity part and the common sense part where we're running into a problem with some of our policies. And yes, Steel is the bus company and Steel, but they will only react to what the policy says. If we say, the walking distance is 3 miles or 20 miles or 50 feet, that's what they enforce. So we can't really pin it on them, I don't believe, where the issue is when we make a policy, we make those decisions, and are we prepared to recognize that there are some legitimate circumstances with some of our parents and some of our kids? Just a comment. Thank you.
So essentially what you're saying is we want flexibility in the delivery of the service. We need to build flexibility in the policy.
Mr. Chair, I have a comment.
Yes, go ahead, Trustee McConnell.
If we go back to September 2019, which is when we last addressed the policy of transportation, student transportation, the student transportation policy was adjusted based on the recommendations of STEO to ensure that we had efficiencies. We made changes to our walking distance because that's what STEO wanted us to do. Come on, remember those conversations, right? It's our policy, but it was based on the recommendation of what STEO said in order for them to achieve efficiencies. We have done this with the meat of the matter being efficiencies. In order to get those efficiencies, we had to adjust the policy. So you want to adjust the policy back? The difficulty is that the policy, this is STEO's train of thought, we need to have the same policy with our coterminous board. The problem with that, and we talked about this last fall, is that it is a disadvantage to them, or to us, I should say, when we have that matching policy, because it doesn't affect them the same way. And that was the comment that was raised last fall, but we still went ahead and we made the changes to the policy based on the recommendation of STEO. Now you want to bring it back in-house? We got to remember, are we the dog or are we the tail here? Who's wagging who? And I think we need to be careful on what we're going to do, because there is an implication on funding. If we just put forward this process to say we're going to put more money aside to deal with these situations, but not go back and figure out how we're going to make sure that how we transport our students is different than what our coterminous board does, we're going to have other issues from a funding standpoint, because when they come down and review STEO, then we've got bigger issues, because they look at us from an evaluation standpoint as how well it's being, this consortium, how well we're implementing it across both boards. So we need to make sure that we dig a little deeper on this one than just simply doing what we're trying to do tonight.
Thank you. Any further comments or questions?
Yes, it's Trustee Swan.
Yes, go ahead, Trustee Swan.
I have a question for Trustee McDonald. How do you recommend that we deal with this for the efficiencies that we're really talking about, that are efficiencies, but they live next door to each other?
Mr. Chair?
Yes, go ahead. Thank you.
I think, and that's the reason why I asked for another review, I think we need to be aware that, yes, efficiency need to occur, but not at the detriment of common sense or a gray area. And I think when we look at these types of things, we had a lot of exceptions in the past that were allowed. Johnny lived on the corner and was able to go to this school because that's where they did it. And it didn't cause any problems at the time. But as soon as we started to make those efficiencies and change the policy and said there were going to be no exceptions to the policy, that's where we started getting into trouble. We always had, a few calls around transportation, but over the last year and a bit, we've had more calls because we've been very strict on how the policy was to be enforced, right? There was no open seat piece. There was no gray area for Johnny to make sure that he got this bus. We've taken away that flexibility at an administrative level because superintendents made those decisions for what was best for the student. And that happened on a regular basis. And all of a sudden, we made these changes, and now here we are having to deal with the consequences. And I think we need to find a way to go back the way it was before, when there's flexibility to make those decisions, what's best for the student, make sure that they continue to have their education where they were, whatever the case may be. And I think, if we just allow that review to take place again, then it gives us that flexibility to be able to understand what we're doing. And I think we don't need it in the policy to create flexibility, right? That's a directive that administration can look at as well, without policy.
Chair, if I could comment, please?
Yes, go ahead, please.
That is exactly the intent of my motion, which is to provide some kind of flexibility. And I don't think another review of our relationship with SAIL is the answer. The efficiencies that we have realized with SAIL at this point, they're good. We're looking at $4.2 or $4.3 million efficiencies. And that is what the public expects of us. So I don't think this is a SAIL problem, honestly. I don't think another review will resolve the issue. I think we need some tweaking. And that tweaking has to occur at our board level. And we have to pay the piper, and therefore that does not affect SAIL. So I guess that's my comment.
Thank you.
May I have a comment, Mr. Chair, or several?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Thank you. Sometimes efficiencies, sometimes get mixed up with effectiveness. They're two different things, and they mean something else. But I would remind trustees that in transportation, we may very well be dealing with spacing issues come fall, and common bell times may be a problem if their kids are going part days or with a different schedule. There's still some uncertainty out there, and perhaps a review generally of how we deliver it, transportation may be advised. And my third comment is it's kind of illuminating that a motion like this can come forward in short order. It's good to know. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee McFred. I'm going
Chair,
to...
Chair, I have a question.
Yes, go ahead, please.
To Trustee McAllister.
Yes.
Would it be more efficient at this particular point just to drop the second part of the motion, John, and not refer it to the not take it to policy 120 at this point, but just establish that reserve so that we can deal with any additional issues without changing our policy? Then look at what David is suggesting, which is to look at the whole issue in a different format, not the policy. So you still get the first part, doesn't go to policy at this point?
I would agree with that.
David, would that fit a little bit as to what you're talking about?
If I may, Mr. Chair, it does, but I want to make sure I emphasize the funding for transportation is very strict. You get what you get, and if you don't spend it and you have it left over, you get less the next year. So if we start to build a contingency, it may impact the operation. So I think we need a little bit more understanding if we do this, will it impact future funding for transportation? So I'm not against making sure that we make these changes. I want to make sure that we do it and not, impact us down the road. That's my only concern. I think we're honestly trying to get the same thing. It's just, as I said before, we're just going about it different directions. That's all.
Thank you. Comment on process. September may be a different world. We've obviously identified an issue, but have we really got the solution here? So I'm going to ask for direction from the table. Do you want to proceed with the motion, or is there some format for fleshing this out a wee bit more, or referring it to committee?
Chair, if I may
yes.
ask, definitely I want to proceed with the motion.
Okay.
And I mean, that is why I presented the motion. I spent a lot of time to work on it, and we all represent a lot of people involved in this. And I'm quite willing to support the first and the second one, but I'm certainly adamant about the first one.
Okay, that is establishing a contingency fund. Okay. Any further comment or question?
Yes, just a comment.
Yes, go ahead, Trustee Swan.
Where does the first one end? Through you, Chair. Is it serving the needs of Upper Canada District School Board students?
Anyone care to respond?
Yes, I would say it ends with the families who attend Upper Canada District School Board schools. You leave out the end.
Okay, so essentially then, secondary question, a contingency could be $1 right now, just to get this on the table and look at the way we deliver these services when we know more about it, and then we could refer to policy or whatever. So by approving the first part, I mean, we could put $1 contingency or $100 in the budget, whatever, just to bring this back to the table and agree this is something we need to address. Correct?
That would be my understanding.
Mr. Chair, it's Stephen speaking. May I just comment for a moment?
Yes, go ahead.
Wearing my Secretary of the Board hat here, Mr. Chair, what staff have right now recorded based on the conversation that's unfolded so far is that, and the motion reads, that sufficient resources be allocated by the Upper Canada District School Board during the budget deliberations for 2020-2021 to create a budget contingency so to address potential additional costs for providing student transportation services due to unforeseen transportation requests received from families whose children attend UCDSB schools. So, Mr. Chair, from our perspective as staff tracking the conversation so far, we believe that that's where the matter stands right now, and that we believe is the motion on the floor, subject, Mr. Chair, to the mover, Mr. McAllister, and the seconder, Trustee Swan. Over to you, Mr. Chair.
I would agree with that, Chair.
Okay, Trustee Swan.
I agree. I seconded it for discussion, so that's fine.
Okay, any further comments or questions? Hearing none, I would like to call the vote. Please cast your ballots online.
Mr. Chair, I'm just waiting on 2, 1.
Pardon?
I'm just waiting on 1.
Okay, all right.
My internet has cut out here.
Trustee McCray, how would you like to vote?
Abstain.
Okay. Mr. Chair, that motion carries.
Okay, thank you. Oh,
Mr. Chair, may I introduce another motion?
yes, go ahead, Trustee McDonald.
I'd like to have a motion that we receive a report from Steel as to the funds for the last 5 years that were in excess of daily transportation for students.
Do we have a second for the motion?
This is Trustee Pedersen. I second the motion.
Okay, moving and seconder. Any discussion?
Excuse me, Mr. Chair. Trustee McDonald,
yes.
Can you say that motion again, if you would, so I can type it out exactly the way you said it?
Yeah, sure. I would ask that the report come from Steel, identifying the amount of funds available after our student transportation is provided, so for the last 5 years. Our day-to-day student transportation.
Okay. Trustee McDonald, do you mind if I email this to you just to confirm what you would like this to say?
Sure, that's fine. Yep.
Okay.
Can we get a point of clarification, Chair, please?
Yes, go ahead.
I'm not really sure what Trustee McDonald, David, I'm not really sure what it is you're requesting. I'd like to know exactly what it is before I vote on it.
For sure, yeah. I'm going to speak to it if, as soon as we're ready, the chair's ready.
Yes,
Trustee McDonald, I have emailed that motion to you for clarification and confirmation.
And I also have a point of clarification I'd like to ask.
Yes, go ahead, Trustee Swan.
Is this the cost of transportation before litigation, like what we thought we were on track for?
So, yeah, may I, Mr. Chair, may I clarify my intent of the motion then? Yeah.
Go ahead, please.
So the purpose of the motion is really to understand that the funding that we do receive for transportation, after we have decided on what our boundaries are, after we have decided on what we are going to transport students with, how much is left over at the end of the year that STEO has had to allocate for other things. I recall being on STEO board, having discussions about efficiencies that have taken place and funds that are available at the end of the year, and those funds being expensed to support other school transportation. So I'm talking about day-to-day transportation of our students from home to school, school to home, and what we would normally have the 20-some thousand students on an annual basis. And so I want to make sure that we as a board understand that there is money, or there potentially is money available after we do all of that. And so that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for STEO to provide a report for the last 5 years on how much is left over after we do the transportation of students from home to school, school to home. It's not taking into consideration the litigation. The litigation is a side note. I'm looking at the overall expenses that we would incur, the residual amount of revenue that we would have after that transportation has taken place.
Okay, thank you.
So, Chair, I would have a question for clarification too.
Yes, go ahead, please.
David, do I understand then from what you're suggesting is that we, even though the motion's passed and I agree with it, that when we see this all flushed out, there really is no need for contingency because there's actually money still there that we can tap, as opposed to putting extra money in a budget? Is that the kind of thing you're looking at?
Absolutely. I think before we actually pass motions that impact our spending, we should understand whether we have any available resources. So that's what I'm trying to understand here.
Okay. If that's the case, David, I would support that.
If I'm wrong, I'm happy to support making sure we have money. I just want to make sure that we've crossed all our bridges.
So have we got the motion clarified yet?
And what's provided to me, yeah, it's fine, yep.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, it's Stephen
May
speaking.
I have a question?
Okay, who's first there?
Mr. Chair, it's Stephen speaking. I just wanted to clarify. I had a slightly different note, and I'm just sending it to Trustee McDonald and to yourself and to Lisa Workman, just to confirm that we've got the right piece here. It might be just a minor adjustment here, but we'll just confirm that while perhaps you entertain the question. We just want to make sure we captured the motion correctly.
Chair McPherson?
Yes, go ahead.
I have a concern about this motion, and the reason I have a concern is that if this was an issue, why was it not brought forward before now? And what is the relevance between this motion and the motion that was passed?
So, essentially what you're saying, okay, I'm pulling up another motion here. Okay, Trustee McDonald, prepared to respond?
So to the director, Stephen, that's accurate. Mr. Chair, the reason I bring it up now is because I think it's very, we need to make sure that before we provide funds to support something that we believe is a problem, we need to uncover all of the areas. And I tried to speak to it. People voted in favor of it, but I want to see the evidence now as to whether we do have funds left over. My recollection is that as a result of efficiencies, we often have times where there are additional funds at the end of the school year. So I want to be able to confirm that. If I'm wrong, I'm happy to indicate that I'm wrong, but I think STEO needs to be able to come to us and share that information. That money is transportation money that we receive, we give to STEO, and then it is utilized. If it's utilized outside of the transportation of our students, then we need to know that. That's money that we can use to adjust some of those efficiencies. That's money that we can use to deal with some of these issues that we're dealing with, or potentially going to deal with through this policy or through this motion that was just passed.
Okay, thank you. Any further comments or questions?
Yes, it's Trustee Swan.
Yes, go ahead, Trustee Swan.
I have a question. And my question is probably to a superintendent, maybe Superintendent Hobbs. I think you spoke to it earlier. So we have a potential surplus in busing this year because of COVID, but we don't know what next year looks like. Is this surplus going to be allowed to be carried over into next year? I think we need a lot more discussion on that, but this is my question.
Through you, Mr. Chair, that surplus predominantly is the result of the pandemic, but also to some extent a result of the fact that the combined effect of the efficiencies, namely the bell time changes, was more, shall we say, more effective than STEO had initially anticipated. So we were able to generate more savings through those efficiencies than they had originally projected. And then the second piece of it is I think that the mitigation funding that came through with the from the Ministry of Education was probably had a greater effect than anticipated. So even without the COVID funding, I believe the anticipated position pre-COVID was that there was still going to be we were still going to have a fairly generous revenue position. But to answer your actual question about carrying it forward, no, any surplus that we encounter at the end of the fiscal year gets rolled into our accumulated surplus available for compliance and would not be available to us for the subsequent year.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any further comments or questions?
Yeah, I have a comment.
Yes, go ahead, please.
Just to Trustee McAllister to try to answer, I think my interpretation of his question. I don't believe David's motion negates the previous motion that we had, because we're going to go ahead with it anyway from the previous motion, and then we're going to collect the data that David is looking for to see what we're going to do further or whatever we need to do. But I think it's in conjunction with the motion you had. We're already going ahead with the resources for next year. So that's my interpretation of what's happening.
Okay, thank you. Any further comments or questions? Hearing none, I will ask.
Mr. Chair, it's Stephen speaking.
Yes, I was going to call
I think, Mr. Chair, for the benefit of people who are listening into tonight's proceedings, perhaps you would like to read the motion so that it's clear what the trustees are now, it looks like they're proceeding to vote on at this juncture. So may I turn that back over to you to be read?
Okay, the motion I have in front of me is that move that Steele provide a report to the Upper Canada District School Board of Trustees identifying the amount of funds available at the end of each year from the past 5 years based upon the daily transportation of students. Everyone have that clear? Okay, I will call the vote. There's no objections. And I will ask Lisa to vote.
Mr. Chair, that motion carries.
Okay, thank you very much. And that concludes this session, and turning it back to Chair McAllister.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Good job. I'm now going to move to, where am I going? I'm going to move into private session. Am I correct, Director?
That's correct, Mr. Chair. You're on item 15, item, you would be reviewing item 1701. Then you're moving now, Mr. Chair, to item 1801.
Thank you. I have a motion moved by Trustee Danaher, seconded by Trustee McDonald, that the Upper Canada District School Board move into Committee of the Whole June 17th, 2020 at 9:48 p.m. Please cast your ballot.
Mr. Chair, that motion carries.
Thank you. A second motion. It's moved by Trustee Jacob, seconded by Trustee McPherson, that Committee of the Whole move into private session to June 17, 2020. Please cast your ballots.
Mr. Chair, that motion carries.
Thank you. We are now in private session, are we not?
Yes. Chair McAllister, can we